Good morning. For those of you who are here in the audience, good morning. And for those of you who are online, also good morning. We had a phenomenal day yesterday. I'm going to introduce our university a little bit and say a little bit about the events that we've had here. Even though for those of you who were here, and I see most of you who were here yesterday are going to have to listen to me again, so I will be very quick and turn it over to General Gray. What I wanted to say a little bit about is that this is not a new thing for the University of South Florida. We do a number of these events through the Institute for Public Policy and Leadership and through our partners. And our partners for these events are General Scott Gray and David Kotok. David is from Cumberland Advisors, and we've been working with David for many years, but as long as I've been here, which has now been 6 years, we've put on some wonderful symposia with David. Yesterday I mentioned specifically, we started out with David doing financial literacy for students, but mostly for the community. We had the Selby Auditorium filled with people as we did these financial literacy programs for mostly, as I said, mostly the community. Then David got involved with knowing all kinds of people, as he does, in the Global Interdependence Center, and moved on to some things like climate change. And we've had some phenomenal climate change symposia here that have brought in people who are very interested, particularly in Florida, and what are the predictions for Florida and what are the predictions for the years to come. And these have turned out to be extremely good and very valuable through what's called the Climate Adaptation Center. And we've also had David do one on Cuba and a very relevant time of Cuba. But David's been with us for a long time, and you will meet David. He is unfortunately not here at the moment, but he will be here today. And then by chance, I think a year ago, General Gray came in, and General Gray got to know us through a number of people where he lives out on Longboat Key. And somebody said to him, you ought to go to the University of South Florida and think about doing a symposium on the Ukraine. And so David came in and said, can we do maybe an hour and a half, can we do a meeting on Ukraine? We all really liked the idea. This was shortly after the conflict had begun. Was that right? Not calling it the conflict. Had begun, and we started that program, and we got so excited about it that we ended up doing 4 sessions and 4 half-day sessions, and these were pretty much online, although some were in person, and we did 4 of them every 2 weeks. And they were really phenomenal at the time because not everybody knew a lot. And Scott will tell you who he brought in. He brought in some totally amazing speakers for this. So this is a continuation. It was to be Ukraine a year later. Where are we today and where are we going and what's going to happen? And then we got to the point where I had said to David, I don't understand cryptocurrency. I was very interested in cryptocurrency. I was very interested in blockchain, very interested in artificial intelligence, and had been working on a long paper that I've been writing just for the fun of it and for my own personal knowledge to try to understand a lot more of these emerging technologies, which I would now say are emerged technologies. They are not just emerging. And so we got into David said, well, I'll do something on cryptocurrency. So that's how we sort of pivoted from Ukraine into cryptocurrency. And then as we started talking about the Ukraine conflict, we brought in China and we brought in other parts of the world. So today is a continuation of the pivot. And I think this is going to be extremely exciting. Our first speaker I don't think is here yet, which is why I'm sort of talking a little bit too long. But we will manage to put the program together and bring him in when he gets here. I'm going to say just a couple of words about our university. You are here at the University of South Florida, Sarasota Manatee, which is one of 3 campuses for the University of South Florida. University of South Florida is one of the top 50 universities in the nation in terms of major research universities. We are a preeminent university in the state of Florida. We have students from well over 125 countries in this university, and we have about 50,000 students, not here. We have a lot of students. We don't have too many who are actually homed here, a couple thousand here, but we teach 14,000 students because now that we are consolidated into one university, it's one USF with 3 campuses, our students can take courses on any one of the campuses. So what this does for us is it takes our what we had about 40 majors on this campus. I'm not even sure it's that many. But we now have over 200 majors that our students can take advantage of, and they can take courses at any one of the universities without paying extra, and that wasn't the case before. And they can do them online, they can do them in person, or however they want to do them. And then it allows us to expand our programs here, and a number of things allow us to do that. One is right outside the windows here, and that is the building, the new building of our Residence Hall Student Center that will be up in 1 year, and we will now for the first time have students on campus. But even more exciting, on the other side of the campus will be a new nursing STEM building, and that's what it's called by the legislature, but it's really going to be broader than just nursing and STEM. It's going to be health sciences overall and STEM, and on Monday we're having an ideation session with students, faculty, campus, and community to talk about what do you want in that building. 75,000 square feet, and we've got to get it right because it's going to be a long time before we get another building on this campus. And so we will have 2 different ideation sessions and really listen to what people want out of it. But it will focus a lot on nursing and STEM. So it's a pretty exciting opportunity for this campus, and it'll be an opportunity for us to now be a residential campus. And I think one of the most exciting things, and many of you probably know that, airport is straight across the street from us. And so what's that mean? It means that we're starting an aerospace engineering program here. And I'm just talking again because we're killing time until our keynote speaker comes. But the neat thing about that is this is going to be the only, I will stop for a minute and tell you, SRQ is the fastest growing airport in the world, not in the nation, but in the world, in terms of the rapidity of the number of people that come to that airport. It's also going to be the only airport in the nation that's going to have an academic campus on the airport. And there's going to be a K through 12 program for minority and underprivileged children to focus their education, their K through 12 education, in the aviation discipline. So those who are interested in something very specific can come to that school. There's also going to be an A&P program, an airframe and power plant program that we are doing joint. We're not doing it jointly. We're part of it, but that'll be run by the technical colleges here, and then we are going to add on to it modules so that the students that come out of that with their technical degrees are also going to have an opportunity for college courses in logistics, in supply chain, in cybersecurity, and a whole bunch of different disciplines so that they will have a leg up on others coming out of it. And then our aerospace engineering program is going to take place both on the airport and on this campus. So this is an exciting place to be. It's a growing place, and we've got a lot of future ahead of us. So I think I've probably said enough about us and about me and about everything else here. So I'm going to turn it over to Major General Scott Gray, who we met a year ago and has been a phenomenal partner with us. And he'll tell you more about his organization and the kinds of things that he's been doing, and the people he has been recruiting are just wonderful. So, General.
Thank you very much. With all due respect, Dr. Holbrook and I said, what are we going to do? And I said, we're going to tap dance. Ma'am, you could be on Tap Dancing with the Stars. There's no doubt about that. So it's an honor to be up here. And thank you again, Dr. Holbrook, for what we have done to bring this together. I mentioned yesterday that it was about a year ago that we started putting the agenda together. In September, we put it to bed. And now you stop and take a look at what we're actually talking about this whole semester, if you will. This is the 4th of them. We've been right on topic, and the fact that we are able to look ahead and predict with such accuracy is really a testament to the team, I think. We've had a lot going on, but I do want to step back for just a moment here and talk a little bit about the Air and Space Force Association, okay, AFA. We've now included space. We've changed our name. We are an 80,000 strong organization, of which I'm the president of the West Coast chapter, which goes from Tampa down to the Everglades and over to Sebring. And we've got about 600 folks that are members of it. And the purpose of the AFA is 80,000 strong. And what we do is we try to educate civilians and keep the military folks that get out educated on what's going on in the current Air Force, what's going on in Congress, what's going on as far as development and future needs of the Air and Space Forces. Under Trump, we did stand up the Space Force. What we did was we went to all the services that had space assets and combined them under one. So that's an ongoing process right now. The majority of those forces came from the Air Force, but the Navy, the Army, and Marines all contributed tremendously. Up at MacDill, we've got a headquarters now for Space Force. It's working with the Joint Special Operations Forces up there. And over on the East Coast, Patrick Air Force Base is now Patrick Air and Space Force Base. And they're very hugely tied in with all the launches that go on down at Cape Kennedy. So it's an exciting time for our Air Force. We've got a lot of problems. You've been reading about it, I think, about the recruiting problems with the United States military in general. The vast majority of kids out there today are not qualified for the military due to various reasons, and that's hurting recruiting tremendously. A lot of it's obesity, a lot of it because you got to be physically fit to serve. A lot of it is criminal or drug activity that's preventing them from coming in. A lot of it's prescription drugs that will prevent you from coming in the military. And then you've got a declining population of people that have served. And historically, you get the majority of your recruits from parents or uncles or aunts that have served and said, hey, what a great thing this is to an 18-year-old that's making a life decision. So we've got some problems as a nation right now. We have a declining birth rate, as does the vast majority of the world out there right now. So that's one of the big things that's going. I will make a prediction that within the next 5 years, the draft will be back, all right? And I will also make a prediction when it comes back that females will be part of that draft, okay? That's just how much we've had as far as evolution goes, as far as societal norms. And the military has always been a way to bring about societal change. In 1947, when they signed the NDAA, they stood the Air Force up as a separate service, okay? And that was Truman that did that. In there, he also said DOD will no longer discriminate, and that's the way that the nation started moving away from discrimination. The first ones to integrate was actually DOD, the Department of Defense. So we've always used the military as a way for shaping societal change, if you will. So like I started off with, in September we started putting this together, and it's been really interesting. We've had some tremendous speakers, but I'm not sure that we ever anticipated that we would have the governor of the Federal Reserve come and talk. And they told me today that that whole talk was put out over Twitter, so it went worldwide. And Dr. Waller knows that anytime he talks, it's probably going to go worldwide, and that one definitely did. We had a conversation, David and I had a conversation yesterday about, I'm the president and CEO of Combat Wounded Veterans Challenge. And what we do is we work with veterans who've got amputations, traumatic brain injury, PTSD, and we'll take them on what we call challenges. One of our challenges going on right now is up at St. Pete in conjunction with the St. Pete Yacht Club. We're teaching them to sail, which is a very phenomenal exercise as far as how to use your brain. Imagine somebody that's had a traumatic brain injury and his head is basically fiberglass plates, or Kevlar plates, if you will, and he's got very limited mobility. Getting him into a sailboat and teaching him to sail, he's actually manning the tiller for the race today. All right, so we were able to do that in 1 week with him. We have a big challenge coming up in July where we will take these veterans and we'll teach them to scuba dive. All right, and then after we've taught them to scuba dive, we get to open water training, teaming with Moat Marine from Sarasota here, Dr. Crosby's organization. We take them out, we plant coral in the reefs, trying to regenerate the reefs. So now you're taking a veteran who's been busted up, who served his country. We now give them another skill set. We bring in researchers to observe what's going on. We bring in prosthetic manufacturers to observe the prosthetics and how they're working, how they aren't. We give them all a Montreal Operative Cognitive Assessment test before and after to measure improvement or degradation. And then we turn all that research stuff over to prosthetic manufacturers and to the VA so we can chart what's happening here. Well, based on those conversations, David and I were talking yesterday, how can we take my nonprofit and put it to good in the Ukraine? Well, last night we contacted Walter Reed up in Washington, D.C., and they actually have a bilateral amputee from the Ukrainian Army that we are going to invite down to Key West in July to come join us and see what we're doing down there. So this little plan, all right, and then through the networks of the University of South Florida, the networks of David, who is a collector of people, there is no doubt about that, and his network's incredible, and then he coupled it with GIC. We're taking this thing to new levels, which is just phenomenal, I think. The last thing I really want to talk about is what we're going to try to do today. When we get General Carlisle on, we're going to talk about China. And it's a pivot, because last year when we were putting this together, we really hoped that the Ukraine would be old news. It's not old news, and it's not going to be old news. As I said, every general officer we've had in here says they predict that this will go on one more year. Today's newspaper is talking about how Secretary of Defense Austin is over in Europe, talking about the $325 million worth of supplies that we're now transferring over there for the spring offensive, which we know is coming. So it's very much a hot topic. But General Carlisle is a very unique individual. He's had numerous commands, and one of his commands was the Pacific Air Forces. So he was in charge of all the fighters and bombers over in the Pacific region. So he's a China expert, if you will. He's a regional expert. From that job, he went to command ACC, the Air Combat Command, and he had command of, it's staggering, actually, when you sit down and take a look. He had 1,300 aircraft, 34 wings, 19 bases, and more than 70 operation locations worldwide, with 94,000 active duty and civilian personnel. When mobilized with the National Guard and the reserves, he inherited another 700 aircraft, 49,000 more people. All right, so here's a man who graduated from the Air Force Academy in 1979, became a very accomplished pilot, went up through the ranks, became an expert first in Central region, because he's fought so much over in CENTCOM when we were doing the desert stuff. Then he became a regional expert for the Pacific, all right, and was able to take that to be the leader of the Air Combat Command, which oversaw all the bombers and fighters that the Air Force had worldwide. And when we get him on here, I think he's going to be an amazing speaker, and Kelly says he's still not on, all right? So what we're going to do is we're going to take a second. Okay, hold on one second. We got one other. Michael, come on up.
So we do this a lot, so I'm used to vamping too. And my name is Michael Drury. I'm a past chairman of the Global Interdependence Center. And I just wanted to talk a little about the Global Interdependence Center and some of the programs that we have coming up. So if you like travel, you should take a look at our website, www.interdependence.org. We will be going to Dublin on May the 16th for a conference that will be featuring the Central Bank of Ireland and a visit to the Guinness Warehouse, which is always important. On July 16th, we will be in Jackson Hole, Wyoming for the Teton Economic Outlook, a one-day event there in conjunction with, it'll be at the Wart Hotel for those who know the area. In September, on September 28th, we're returning to Montreal for a program there. This will be the second year that we've done a program up in Canada, and a lot of interesting different views north of the border. They don't look at the world quite the same way as the U.S., so it's always interesting to see what your closest neighbor and largest trade partner is thinking. And then on December 1st, we'll be going to Dubai as part of the COP28 programs. The last time we were in Dubai was 2013, and it was one of the greatest events I've ever been at. So I strongly recommend that you think about that. We probably will be visiting Sheikh Nahyan's palace in Abu Dhabi. He was the Minister of Education when we last went, and now I can't remember what position he's in. Royal family, who cares? You know, this is the kind of programming that we put on throughout the year, as well as the virtual. It is a membership organization. It costs an extravagant $200 to join GIC, which gives you access to everything online, preferential treatment at programs. So I strongly suggest everyone who hasn't joined, join, or we'll find you, track you down. We have your phone numbers. No, these kind of programs that we've been doing for years, find hugely beneficial. That I'm one of the major sponsors, my firm is, because long ago I figured out that it was a lot better to deal with just GIC, who has a very wide range of interests, than it was to, hire every firm on Wall Street to try to tell me what was going on. But do we have a speaker yet?
We do.
We do. Excellent.
All right. Hey, thank you, Mike. Appreciate it. Okay, we're going to do what we call in the military Rolex. That means change times, okay? And what we're going to do is we're going to bring up our first panel of the day, which is going to talk about China and economics. And we're very fortunate to have the moderator, Alejandra Grindel, here. And I have been fishing with her. David Kotok would always talk about fishing. Well, I have been fishing with her, and I will tell you, she's an accomplished fisherwoman. She can skin an eel as well as anybody can, which is part of the initiation rites at Camp Kotok. But on top of that, she's just absolutely brilliant. So would you please like to come up and help us with our panel here? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Scott, for that excellent introduction. Really enjoyed fishing with you and truly being part of this super cool world that the GIC puts us together. So I'm also going to, encourage you all to join. It's a really great group. So super excited to introduce today's panel. It's all about China's economy. And right here to my left, we have some of the most renowned experts in the field when it comes to China. So to my left, I have Leland Miller. He is the CEO of China Beige Book International, which many of you know is the world's leading data and analytics and economic forecasting firm focused on China, as well as operator of the largest proprietary data collection network ever developed to track a closed economy. Not an easy thing to do. Leland is also a board member of the GIC. To his left, we have Malcolm Riddell. He is the founder and CEO of China Debate. He is also an associate in research for the Harvard Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies. Malcolm, I found this on your LinkedIn profile. I love this. As an investment banker, diplomat, lawyer, Harvard academic, and CIA spy, Malcolm has participated in China affairs for 40 years. Very cool. And then last but not least, we have Michael Drury, who I've actually had the pleasure of moderating a panel with him a few years ago in NABE, so we have met before. He is the chief economist for McPhee Trading and Investment, so my kind of people, I like chief economists, where he assesses macroeconomic developments around the world to help develop hedging strategies using futures markets and interest rates, currencies, and industrial materials. As Michael mentioned, he is on the executive committee of the GIC. Today, we are just going to all handle questions and answers. I'm going to share several questions with our panel today. And then I suppose toward the end of the session, we will then open up the Q&A to our audience. So let's get started. So this panel is all about China's economy. So I think it's good to set the stage on where China's economy stands today. We know China recently reopened. It ended its zero COVID policy. The numbers look fairly decent, but where is China going to be headed this year, maybe through early next year? I think an important thing I want to hear about too is the rest of the global economy is not doing so great. So can China pull the global economy out of recession like it did during the global financial crisis? And then also we have something new today. We have inflation problems. So how can China impact global inflation? Because I personally can see some inflationary as well as disinflationary factors. So Leland, you're on the ground. I think it is a very good question to direct toward you first. Take it away.
I think the good news is that 2023 will be better than 2022. And that's not going to be hard because 2022 was a disaster. COVID zero was an absolutely supply chain snarling, demand crushing exercise in futility. And what we had gotten from our survey network, probably the most important takeaway from 2022, was that firms kept telling us, as long as COVID zero exists, we're not going to invest, we're not going to borrow, and we're not going to hire. So back in the spring, when there were lockdowns and the lockdowns were eased and everyone got excited that there'd be some sort of bounce back in spending, we knew that there was going to be no bounce back because firms were depressed. And what we saw actually surprised us because things just kept getting worse and worse and worse because firms were actually shutting down. They said, we're not going to risk going into being thrown into quarantine or having our businesses shut down or what have you. Until COVID zero is done, we're out. Well, COVID zero is over. So what happens now? I think we're going to see a couple of different things. It was always a problem to think that when the COVID zero Band-Aid was pulled off or phased out, but the Band-Aid was pulled off, that we were going to see a quick reopening of the economy. We were never going to see a quick reopening because everyone's going to get sick with COVID. So there was an expectation that this would be quick. What's actually happening is, December, January, February, everyone got sick, COVID zero, the structures that were in place were getting pulled back, and now you're actually seeing the economy reactivate. So reactivate's the key word, not reopening. If you look at what's happening in March, our Q1 data were weaker than what the government announced. The government wanted to tell a very happy story about the first quarter because the new Xi administration was in place and they had to show that the COVID zero decision as it played out was a good one and that there's competent people there. So the fact that they had a 4.5% GDP growth in the first quarter is a little bit silly. There was nowhere near that level of growth. But it doesn't really matter because this was always the phase out of COVID zero. We're expecting much better growth in the second quarter. If you look at our March data, it was much better than our February data. If you look at the composition, retail and services firms seem to be gearing up. They started reinvesting. They started hiring again. So we're looking at the second quarter being much better. Potentially, there being sort of rising, sort of elevated levels of growth for 2 to 4 quarters, even into early 2024 in a best case scenario. So we're seeing all these positive tailwinds. Firms are getting back into it. Consumers, maybe they're not doing the revenge spending everyone figured, but they'll travel more. They'll do more than they did in 2022. And then, of course, your base of comparison is off 2022. And so even mediocre numbers are going to look pretty good in 2023. So you got all these things that are just screaming cyclical bounce back. And so we are going to see a cyclical bounce back in China. It's probably already begun. And so that's very important. But what's more important than that is that it's a head fake. And the reason it's a head fake is 2023 is going to feature a cyclical bounce back from a very low levels of growth from previous, but the more important dynamic is the structural slowdown in the backdrop. You're seeing a long-term structural slowdown in China to very, very low levels of growth. The party is in on it. The party is helping foster this. They've moved away from prioritizing high levels of growth and stimulating into weakness. They're not worried about the same things they've been worried about for the last 20 years. So at this point, you're going to see a better 2023. That's going to lead a lot of people to say, she gave up or she's changed his mind. He realized the error of his ways and, we're going back to the old way. We're not going back to the old way. We're going to see a couple of quarters worth of better growth. And then we're going to revert back to the dominant paradigm, which is a long-term structural slowdown in the Chinese economy.
Great, thank you. All right, so today's or the past couple of days, this conference is about the future of global finance. So I think a really appropriate question to ask is, we're sort of viewing this new future as maybe like a bifurcated or multipolar world with the United States on one side, China on the other. So in the context of this future of global finance, Michael, I think a good question for you is, what does this mean for the future of the dollar as the world's reserve currency, most actively traded currency? What's your view on that?
Sure. So I like to think of the world differently and turn it on its head. The dollar's not at any risk of not being the reserve currency for the planet for a very, very long time. That's not the question that's important. We are the producer of the reserve currency of the world. We print the dollars. The bigger question is who distributes them. The United States currently runs a $400 billion trade deficit with China. Europe currently runs a $400 billion trade deficit with China. The Chinese run a trade surplus with the world of roughly $1 trillion. That means basically we produce dollars, we hand them out to our consumers, our businesses, which pump them through the world system, and the vast majority of all growth in dollars in the world ends up in China, and the Chinese distribute them. And the question is, how? And the answer is, I don't know, and it scares me to death. Now, there's a lot of military people here at this conference, and people used to ask me that question, say, what keeps you up at night? And my wife is Iranian, so the answer was, what is Qasem Soleimani thinking tonight? Because he was the most dangerous man in the world in the most dangerous part of the world. Today, he's dead, and now what keeps me up at night is what are the Chinese doing with $1 trillion this year, $5 trillion over the last 10 years. It used to be that they bought treasuries with it. Then it was that they let their private sector buy Smithfield Foods and the Hyatt, the Waldorf Astoria, and every home in Vancouver, Canada, and et cetera, et cetera. But the corruption campaign cracked down on that, and so private flows have slowed down. Then a lot of the money went out to Belt and Road projects. Well, the Council on Foreign Relations estimates that at about $1 trillion. And a recent paper by Ken Rogoff and others, the World Bank, et cetera, estimated that they've probably written off a quarter of that, about $240 billion over the last 5 years, half of it in Argentina, which should scare you a little bit. So my question is, what happened to the other $4 trillion? Now, some of it is undoubtedly piled up in treasuries and securities and other state-owned enterprises within China, but we know that they're buying the largest port in Europe that they're currently negotiating for the Hamburg port. We know that they own the largest grid in Portugal. We know that they're making vast investments, not as loans, but as purchases all across Africa. And the question is, you've given them control over the allocation of your currency. We know what happened in Ukraine when basically the Europeans put control of their energy future in the hands of the Russians. And now we're in the same position with respect to the Chinese. People talk about deglobalization. The trade deficit before COVID was $400 billion. The Chinese trade surplus was $400 billion. Today it's $1 trillion. There's not deglobalization. The need for cheaper, driven by COVID, has driven everyone into the Chinese arms. How deeply? Well, we're not going to be in China anymore. We're going away. We're going to go to Vietnam. The United States trade deficit with Vietnam has gone from $20 billion to $40 billion in the last 5 years. The Chinese surplus with Vietnam has increased exactly the same amount. The Chinese run a trade surplus with Mexico of $60 billion. That's an economy that's smaller, about 1/10 the size of the United States. So if you ramp up what that means, they're running a trade deficit that's twice as large as the United States with China. Do you think any of that money's coming in? Do you think any of that money from Vietnam is coming in? They run a $100 billion trade deficit with India, which is the next great, we're going to move someplace else. They don't even like each other, but they run a $100 billion trade surplus. You should worry about where the Chinese are spending their money and how much influence they're buying around the world doing that. You've seen this, Macron went there and kissed the ring. Lula's there now kissing the ring. I mean, there's been this unending flow of people. Where was Biden? Dublin. If we're not going to spend $1 trillion a year in foreign aid, and we're not, they are, and that should worry you. And so that's the main thing I worry about in terms of global interdependence, global trade, and the flow of resources.
Great, thank you. And as a quick follow-up question, as we know, crypto is also a topic of this conference. And Brent, yesterday you mentioned that crypto could potentially be, several decades down the line, a close alternative to replacing the dollar as some sort of world reserve currency. But correct me if I'm wrong, in China, crypto is illegal, right?
Pretty much banned.
Pretty much banned. So in that case, that would make that move even a little harder, especially from a broader scope. Very cool. All right, Malcolm, question for you.
Question for me.
Question for you. So it looks like, at least from our Western perspective, I know one of the things I learned as a global economist is the fallacy of composition, right? Just because something works, see, the nerdy econ terms. I used to be a professor back in the day. Just because something is true here doesn't necessarily mean that that same concept works in other parts of the world. So at least from our Western perspective, it appears that President Xi has made some pretty bad decisions, whether it comes to zero COVID or COVID zero. I don't know the right way to say it. I hear so many different, either or. All right, we're all on this. The crackdowns on tech, crackdowns on property. Do you truly think these are bad decisions on Xi's part? And two, why does he do them?
Well, thank you. It's great to be here today. What I thought I'd do with this question, because I got it in advance, was take a step back and give you 3 ideas that might help you as going forward to analyze. The first is that, and I'll talk about this, each one of these, that we have to see that Xi has always been a Marxist, and he was finally in a position to begin to get back on the socialist road, and we'll talk about that a second. The second thing is that when you hear Xi often talk about the East is rising and the West is declining, he has a certain confidence in China. Now, is this a justified confidence? And when you look at it from his point of view, if he thinks China is on the rise, and perhaps a lot of the moves he's made, we'll call it arrogantly, about announcing wanting to take over major future tech industries at the expense of Western and Japanese and Korean companies and industries, has backlashed. He's ended up with Joe Biden preventing him from getting advanced semiconductors. And the third thing is to think about Xi and how he sees his own heritage. There's a quip in China that with Mao we stood up, with Deng we got wealthy, and with Xi we're getting powerful. And so if we look at these 3 things in the context of some of these economic decisions and some of the impact of other decisions on the economy, so to go into them quickly, we spent from the time of Deng sort of telling ourselves, oh, these guys aren't really communists. You know, they're capitalists. Look at the way they act. Look at all these billionaires, and look at the lavish lifestyles. Look at the money they're making. Look at how they're doing it. These are capitalists. Well, if you go back to Deng's own writing, and of course Deng's the guy who started this whole movement, Deng said socialism isn't poverty, and until we have overwhelming abundance, quote unquote, we have to adopt capitalist means in a capitalist world. And so that's what we saw up until Xi took over. And this is a supposition, is that Xi has the feeling that, yeah, we have overwhelming abundance, now it's time to get back on the socialist road. Well, being on the socialist road leads to all kinds of activities that we see as mistakes, but from a point of view of a good Marxist who's moving with history toward a communist utopia, it's not. If you look, for example, the support of state-owned companies over private companies, this is again the state ownership, you know, of industry, the means of production, and but then you go to a further example of this, and that is he's also a Leninist, and that is he has learned of the strict party control. And one thing, when he was brought into power by the party elders, one of the objects was to strengthen the Chinese Communist Party's control over all of society. It had been weakening especially under Hu. And you saw the anti-corruption campaign, which was a drag on the economy, because if nothing else, officials were too scared to do anything. So an awful lot of that was in there. And you see that these moves toward common prosperity, and on the one hand, a good Marxist idea, all the way over to things like controlling how many hours of video games kids can play, are all part of, I think, all part of a way of looking at the world that is so contrary to the ones that we're used to that it's very hard to pull our heads out and think about something from the point of view of somebody who's a committed Marxist and who believes that China can finally get back on that road. Now, to go back to Lee's point, I think he's also pragmatic enough to, we saw these things begin a couple of years ago in earnest. We had the questions, why in the world would he kill his tech industry? Why kill the golden goose? I collected so many wonderful quotes from the FT and Wall Street Journal and whatever. Why is he doing this? Why is he doing this? Doesn't he know it's hurting his economy? Well, there were other things at play. One, he doesn't like billionaires. He's a communist. He likes everybody to, be pretty much the same. That's what he's shooting for. He doesn't like companies having control of anything. He wants the party to be in control. And when it comes to entrepreneurs, which have been the driving force and are the driving force to so much of the economy, what he has said was, yeah, we love entrepreneurs, but you all have to sort of align yourselves with the party's goals and policies if you want to survive. And interestingly, that's also getting the same kind of wording to foreign companies in China. So if the first lens you look through is Xi Jinping as a Marxist, let's go to the second. That the idea that the East is rising and the West is declining. So Xi Jinping has confidence that history is on his side. And now the question is, when do you make your move against your greatest adversary, the U.S. and the Western democracies, or the advanced democracies? Well, he seems to think this is the time to do it. And we've seen activities, as I mentioned in my short intro, that he announced for example, the Made in China 2025 initiative. The purpose of that was to align China's goals toward becoming leadership in advanced industries, AI, all the sorts of things that we talk about. But at the same time, he was scaring the bejesus out of everybody. He's threatening Taiwan. He's taking over the South China Sea. He's starting wars with India. He's taking over Hong Kong. Chinese are stealing more property. This whole list of complaints that we have toward China, justified or not, has suddenly made us what we have perceived as the arrogance of Chinese position turn against him. And you see this, the great example of this recently is Joe Biden's saying, "Hey, you guys want to advance? You guys want to advance in the key technologies? Great. You're our competitor. We don't see any reasons to help you do it." So he cut off supplies of advanced semiconductors and trying to organize the equipment to do it. In doing this, we see that Xi's actions are hurting his economy, because with productivity and population both going down in China, what you see is that Xi's making a bet on technology. Now, the more we hamper that because of Xi's own actions, then the harder it's going to be for him to overcome that. And of course, we talk about the middle income trap, which is a whole different subject, but whether or not China can gain the prosperity he seeks. So there's a harm to the economy. Finally, if we look at Xi's own ambitions, this is my view, and that is Xi would like to go down as the greatest leader, greatest ruler in Chinese history. Not just greater than Mao, not just greater than Deng, but greater than all the emperors. And if we see that, let's take an example of one of his objectives that he needs to accomplish, and that is a completely reunified China. He's put this as part of his China dream of national rejuvenation. We've seen him take Hong Kong, subdue Xinjiang, and he wants Taiwan. Now, if he were to invade Taiwan, we know what the economic consequences would be for China, the U.S., for the world. But let's think about what he's done with this. he has made Taiwan, and this is why so many folks have come to the conclusion that China is that she is an incompetent dictator, and this is one of the examples that I like. When Nixon met Mao in '73, Mao said to Nixon in response to a question about Taiwan, 100 years, it'll come back. And we didn't see this as a centerpiece of any of the succeeding leaders. It is she who made it the centerpiece of his dream of China rejuvenation. At the same time, with the method of reunification, one country, two systems that we saw being played out in Hong Kong, he went in and destroyed that system. The Taiwanese looked aghast and said, "No, we're not buying any of this. Thanks so much." And then finally, he put out his first white paper. There's been 3 white papers on Taiwan unification, and this was the harshest ever. It's essentially a deal that nobody would take under coercion. So he's backed himself into a corner. He said, "I've got to take Taiwan. I pledged reunification," and it's key to his legacy. But at the same time, he's left himself with no real route to it except military conflict. And we know what that'll do to, as I say, to the economies. So if you look at those from 3 points of view, first, the point of view of he's a Marxist, he's not a capitalist. Second, he has a view of history that the East is rising and the West is declining. And by the way, the East is rising, no question, except it's rising against Xi. If you look at what's happening there, that's a whole different issue. But from an economic point of view, the decisions he's making there are backfiring on him. And third, if we look at what he has to do for his own legacy, many of these decisions that he's making, like the one I just described on Taiwan, are ones that will not permit him to have either to succeed on the socialist road or to have the economic prosperity that earlier generations of leaders were after.
Great, thank you so much. Definitely a lot of information there. All right, so let's move on to just the future of globalization. Michael, you did touch on it, but I'd like to talk a little bit more about it, and especially just in the context of deteriorating U.S.-China relations, which you talked about, Malcolm, and specifically have all these things the U.S. has done, starting with the tariffs, the chip sanctions. This morning I saw news today that Biden plans to sign an executive order to limit investment into China by U.S. businesses. Can another country take China's place? I thought, Michael, that was really fascinating that China is still trading with the United States, just finding another country to do it through. Can they do that for long? And then also, I think a question I also want to address to the panel is, do we want this to happen, right? I mean, look at what happened with Russia. Russia managed to decouple from the rest of the world, and so invading another country, they didn't have much to lose, right? Whereas in the case of China, because of these strong ties to the rest of the world, they do have more to lose, I would think anyway. So please take it away. Does anyone want to have at that question first?
I could start with the decoupling issue, and then we can see how everyone can add to the wisdom. Decoupling is a often misused term because it can mean a lot of things. There is going to be no U.S.-China decoupling in the broader sense. You're not going to see, unless we go to war, you're not going to see a true decoupling of the two economies. It would be too dramatic. It would be too stressful for the global system, for the United States, et cetera. What you are seeing is certain sectoral decouplings, like tech. So, for instance, there was a decision made politically over the last several years. What do we do with China? Do we continue to allow them to have the inputs to not just compete with us, but potentially not just commercially beat us, but also have the inputs, the semiconductors, the advanced technology that will allow this to potentially kill more Americans if we go to war with them? And this is a very difficult question because it doesn't have a right answer. On the one hand, if you say, well, you know what, it's going to be very provocative to cut China off, let's just keep going, then you are handing them the tools to potentially take over the U.S. position of primacy in some of these technological developments. You're giving them the inputs to be able to create better hypersonic missiles and better AI defenses for their military. It's pretty grim. On the other hand, if you look at the other direction, if you cut them off, if you don't cut them off, if you do cut them off, then you're saying to the Chinese, well, look, at this point we've made a decision that we are going to do as American policy and as Western policy more and more, we are going to ring fence China's rise, China's economy from some of these advanced technological inputs that you want and need in order to compete with the West. It seems provocative. So the question is, where do you fall? And I think that this argument has been in the U.S. political system and elsewhere for years and years and years. And it's only in the last couple of years that there has been a decision by Republicans, by Democrats, basically across the U.S. political spectrum, that enough is enough. And at this point, we are going to need to step in and make sure that there is a U.S. lead and a Western lead in these advanced technologies, because they are going to dictate, control the global system going forward, military hegemony, commercial primacy, and other things. And so right now we have these export controls. They're at the baby stage. They're way too hyped for what they actually do right now. But we're talking about the fact that we're not going to allow China access to the most advanced semiconductors. We're not going to allow them to the most advanced inputs, technology for artificial intelligence, quantum computing, some other things. And this is sort of where we're going in terms of putting more and more of the relationship under the banner of national security has to dominate over economics. The issue here is that it's a long spectrum, and right now, we started years and years ago where economics was the only thing anyone cared about, and everyone completely ignored all the national security problems with allowing the Chinese to steal intellectual property and other things for years. It's been gradually moving, so the more and more things fall in the national security bucket, but still not that many. As we go forward, and as U.S.-China tensions rise, and as there's more of a back and forth and quid pro quo on some of these policy battles, we're going to see more and more things fall in the national security basket, and that's going to create more tensions, and that's going to create more of a provocative atmosphere and more of incentive for China to retaliate. And this is one of the reasons why I'm quite worried about the fact, I think, we have been overhyping the possibility that there would be U.S.-China conflict for years and years and years, but I think we've crossed to a new era where the possibility of U.S.-China conflict is now very real by the end of this decade.
I couldn't agree with Lee more. Let me take the flip side of that, and this is before what we're seeing today with so much tension with China. It was a few years ago. And China complains that the West and the U.S. and its allies in Asia are trying to contain it. And it also blames the West, U.S. and its allies in Asia for decoupling. Well, I said years ago, we don't have to contain China. China is containing itself, because China during the this is all supposition, but you can see it play out, and I think that in ways that, if you look at the evidence, it shows that it happened. Is that when former President Trump, initiated his tough China rhetoric, I won't call it even policy or actions, and the trade war, I think Xi Jinping began to see that there were vulnerabilities in China, and so he did what in the same way we saw Russia do this, but before even any of these sorts of things came out, began to say, how can we make China as self-sufficient as possible and as immune from foreign control and of our economy, in this case from the trade war. At the same time, with decoupling, it's not so much that China is looking to decouple as it is to have its own, to be self-sufficient again in the technologies, in the resources, and the other things that China would otherwise be at the mercy of some factors in the world, whether it was war, whether it was closing the Malacca Straits for oil imports, any of these things. So we've got the U.S. on one side and its allies talking about decoupling and contain. Well, they're not talking about containment, but it's effectively a containment strategy. And the Chinese, on the other hand, way before this really has come to a head, saying, hey, we've got some real vulnerabilities here. We want to find them and correct them. So China itself is withdrawing to the extent it can for its own protection. At the same time, with this dual circulation strategy, the idea is to still be open to the outside world. And as one of the things that she has said, that's been a lot's been made of, that he wants strong trade and strong trade relations with other countries as a means of control. And so there's also a geopolitical aspect to the economic one.
So I'm going to be the bearer of bad news. The largest trader in the world runs the world. That used to be Spain, then it was the UK, then it was the US, and today the largest trade partner of every country on the planet is China. And it's China for a very simple reason. If an American capitalist could design a market in which he could manufacture, sell, trade his goods, he would design China. 1.4 billion people speaking a single language with a single autocratically dominated system of dispersion of information of all kinds makes marketing the greatest thing in the world. You know, so now you say, well, okay, China's done, we're going to go to India. 600 different languages, lots of provinces with lots of very restrictive bureaucratic limitations on how fast you can move. Apple just opened its first store in India. Why now? Because they've been stopped from opening one in India for years. Meanwhile, Ford's going to bring an EV from China to sell in the United States. American companies are pouring money back into China right now. The governments of the world have woken up. The national security people in the world have woken up. But we're capitalists. And it's still a very, very attractive market for capitalists. And until someone gets the capitalists in America under control and makes them understand that they are feeding our national security enemy, and Jonathan's going to talk about this at length, nothing's going to change. My attitude, I'm 67, I don't care. It'll be over before, you know, it's not going to affect me, but it's going to affect my children. And, you know, so I worry about this because I don't see the movement to ring fence China being anywhere near strong enough. I see them buying Brazil, buying Argentina. Essentially, they bought Australia years ago, and the Australians won't admit it. You know, I mean, to me, I started going to China in 2005, and the biggest thing was the Chinese figured out somewhere along the line, and it wasn't Xi, but they figured out somewhere along the line that they were never going to get Taiwan, and they were never going to get through the Pacific ring where you've got Korea, Japan, Taiwan, on down. So they built a West Coast. They went out to Xi'an, they went out to Chengdu, they went out to Chongqing, they built railways, and they built railways and went across Russia and went into Europe. And they did what the Mongols and other hordes have done for years and years and years, is they made it a land empire, not a sea empire. Because unlike Spain, unlike the UK, unlike the United States, they will never have the largest navy in the world, ever. So they made it a land war. I don't know, many of you saw The Princess Bride, but you know, you've fallen into one of the great traps. The biggest one is never fight a land war in Asia, and that's where we are. We're fighting a land war in Asia. And they're doing the same thing that the Soviet Union did, where it built buffer states around it to protect itself, which Putin is going back to now, trying to build buffer states around themselves. Well, I mean, they now own the Stans, they own Russia, they own Iran, they're buying Pakistan, they're trying to buy Southeast Asia, they're moving in that direction. If you put a plant in Bangladesh or you put a plant in Vietnam, even if it's an American-owned plant, everything that goes into that plant is manufactured in China. If you build a chip plant in Arizona so that you don't have to worry about TSMC, all of the wiring, all of the nuts, all of the bolts, half of the steel comes from China. That's how integrated our economies are at this point. Everything in this room that costs less than $100 was made in China. It's the answer to cheaper, and until we find a different answer to cheaper, China is going to be a problem. I grew up in Boston, Massachusetts, and long, long ago, Boston was, footwear and all the things that are now Bangladesh. And first it moved to Burlington, North Carolina, then it moved to Mexico, then it moved to China, and now it's moving to Bangladesh. Every step along the way, it was still owned by America until it got to China, and now in Bangladesh, it's owned by somebody out of Hong Kong. So getting our political arena and our capitalist arena in line is going to be a problem. As Martin's pointed out, they don't have that problem in China. They have a communist system, and they've completely controlled their capitalist system. Remember this guy named Jack Ma? I mean, he used to be like the guy. He just accepted a professorship at Hong Kong University because that's where he is today. I mean, they took his company, they took his money, and, they took his voice. This is going to be a long competition. The only good news is their demographics are way worse than ours, way worse. But if the United States doesn't do something about a lot of things, immigration, I think, is the number one because, you have to, if you're going to compete with them, you have to have growth. I really worry about where this goes. And I don't think there's going to be a shooting war. I'm not a big fan of the shooting war argument, but I do think that there's going to be sand in the gears of global growth and that it all slows down. It slows down for them, it slows down for us because a big part of our growth is using their cheaper. And we've got to find a new cheaper, and that's going to, I think, be very, very difficult.
Very cool. And totally second the whole capitalist view, right? At the end of the day, businesses want to make money. And unless the United States engages in extreme industrial policies and high tariffs across the board, they're going to go to the next lowest cost producer. Yeah. And I think another important thing to point out is supply is inelastic. So think about Apple has been on the ground in China. You guys probably know this better than me, 20, 30 years. You can't just pick that up overnight and move to India, even if the labor is cheaper. So it's going to be a long haul for sure. Okay, so I want to do one last question on the geopolitical scope, and hopefully I don't get too controversial here. We have a presidential election coming up soon, and we could have Trump again in office. We could potentially have DeSantis. If one of those individuals becomes the next president, does the U.S. strategy change, and if so, how?
Leland?
I said I could ask this question, so I kept it in there.
So I'll lob something into the pot here. Trump is over here and everybody else is over there. So I think that if you have Trump, it's going to be a completely different type of environment. He's been there before. The people he's going to surround himself with, I know because I know how he's building out his team right now, are not the people who ran his administration's China policy in his first administration. And so there's a very good chance that he is going to govern the relationship and govern every other part of his presidency as shoot by the hip, and I'm going to make one decision one day, and there's going to be absolutely no coherence from one day to the next, to the next, to the next, and there's going to be no policy, strategic policy. It's just going to be a cascading waterfall of decisions that are completely disconnected to each other and only connected by Trump's mood at the time. That's the possibility for Trump. I think if you move out of Trump because he's this fascinating mercurial personality that you can just sort of ponder the consequences of all this. If you look and you just say what most Democrats, most Republicans, I don't think there's going to be that big a difference. I do think that Republicans, by their nature, are a little bit more aggressive and willing to go a little bit more hawkish on China. But what's interesting about the policy here is when Biden came into office, what he wanted to do, or what he told his team to do, is figure out ways to not totally change everything Trump did, but I want to sort of make these policies my own. He hasn't really done that. I mean, he basically inherited the vast majority of Trump's policies and Trump's rationales for competition and challenging China more, and continued them. Now, he has upped the game on export controls a little bit. It's a continuance of what was started in the Trump Commerce Department. So there's been little tweaks here and there. But really, China policy has become this bipartisan consensus, and the only difference is the rapidity of the implementation on certain things. I do think that if you have a second-term Biden administration versus a first-term, say, DeSantis or some other Republican administration, there will be a difference in terms of how fast people will rush in to try to do some things on export controls, some things on expansion of sanctions. There's already a movement, it's just not talked about that much, about identifying these investment flows that Michael's worried about. And what do we do about them? First of all, we have to identify, create transparency around where all this U.S. and Western money is going. Once we do that, figure out what's problematic and start cutting it off from going to the party or to the military. I think that'll happen more rapidly and more aggressively if it's the first term of a new presidency, even if it's a Democrat, versus the second term of the Biden administration when, they've got the Z team in there just sort of sleeping their way through this, the last several years. But generally speaking, there's a bipartisan consensus on China, and I don't think it's going to be that different depending on who's president.
Take it. Okay. No, I have no trouble. I have no trouble with this. As long as I think to do this, we have to identify a little bit of where we stand. I was never a supporter of Donald Trump as president or candidate, but much of his agenda was attractive, especially his pointing out the potential threats from China. I give him full marks for that. The problem with that is with so many of his policies is implementation. Not really enough was done, even though he has some great policies came out, great ideas. Matt Pottinger, I think, you can see his hand in a lot of things, the Deputy National Security Advisor, and a good China guy. So if Trump came back, I think he'd have less of the team, less of the quality team, because mentioning Matt Pottinger, he resigned after the January 6th issue, and I can't imagine him and the other ones coming back. So he'd have a weaker team, and just as Lee says, just as mercurial as ever. So implementation is always the problem. So we go to what if one of the other Republicans get it? Hard to say. I mean, I would have, as long as we're identifying things, I'm not a particularly DeSantis supporter either, but I was particularly concerned about DeSantis' comments on Ukraine, which gave me a sense that he doesn't really get this whole geopolitical thing very well. And so I have no feel for what he really knows about China. Now we go with Biden. So just to be equal opportunity, after the withdrawal from Afghanistan, I couldn't even watch Biden on TV. I couldn't hear his voice. I was so upset. But now I've warmed up. I'm liking the foreign policy, but I'm liking what he's done with the allies. Ukraine, I think he should have done more with Ukraine earlier. But still all on the right track. And with China also on the right track. I'm seeing more actions that I think are making good moves to help us, as not necessarily as good capitalists, but more from the national security aspects that are good. If he continues in office, I would assume that also would continue. But one of the wild cards in here, and I've said this for years, is you have to watch Congress. Not so much because Congress necessarily has the same kind of power in foreign policy that the executive has, but you can see it. You can see a different direction, an influential direction coming from Congress, and I think we've seen that with this new committee that I think Lee's an advisor to in Congress and in the House of Representatives. That are beginning to look at these issues in a bipartisan way. And that gives me a lot of encouragement. I think we may be taking this whole, it's hard we were talking to Lee yesterday, I said, I'm so hawkish, I don't even tell people how hawkish I am because they think I was in one of these crazy fringes. But I think we actually may be going a little too far in our hawkishness, and it's obscuring opportunities to have better relations in the same way we did with the Soviet Union. We weren't great, but at least where we had the opportunities to get along a little bit, we tried to do it and to find ways to ease the tensions. So all in all, if I were putting my money down right this minute, I'd rather Republican or Democrat aside, I'd rather have what Biden's doing right now than what I saw with Trump, or the unknowns with less tested people.
So I'm going to once again turn the question on its head and ask, who would Xi Jinping want to be president of the United States? And, Biden or Trump, he's dealt with them both. And, oh, by the way, they're both lame ducks. They got 4 years. He's got 50. When they're finishing their 4-year term, he'll be just starting his 4th of 25. And so, the Chinese take a very long view. I mean, they knew that they were going to take Hong Kong back. The day they took Hong Kong back, they turned around and said, next is Macau. Now it's Taiwan. Now it's, they take a very long view. They play a very long game. 4 years doesn't matter to them. So I think, to me, it'd be more interesting if it wasn't Trump or Biden, purely from a China point of view, the impact. If it was somebody different, that you might be dealing with an 8-year period of policy as opposed to a 4-year period of policy. But I don't think they worry much about who's running the world. I often tell people, to understand Xi Jinping is a lot better to understand Huey Long than anybody else. He ran his fiefdom. It was his. He had absolute control over it. He didn't worry much about what people thought beyond that. And he worried about making sure he had absolute control over his fiefdom. And I think, people believe Xi Jinping wants to take over the world. I think he is a Marxist. He's much more like Putin. He's much more like Lenin. What he's really concerned about is that he's in absolute control of his 1.4 billion people. And what you do outside, as long as you're not impinging on him, is not a problem. So the trade things, the chip things, those are a problem for him, right? So he has to work on resolving that. How do you resolve that? There's many, many ways, but one thing you do is you have 400,000 students in the United States studying STEM almost exclusively at the master's level, and you bring 90% of them home. I mean, when you look at policies that the United States has that are a disadvantage to us, the entire higher education system in the United States is educating the guy that we don't want educated. So if you're going to cut them off from chip technology, you need to cut them off at the root. And these are very expensive, very difficult decisions for the United States to make. And personally, I don't think we're going to make them. I think we're going to kind of bumble along. And something else will make the decision. The demographics, I don't know. We went through this with Japan, and Japan was going to rule the world. But Japan was much smaller than China. But the thing to keep in mind is it was Japanese money that built China. They were the first ones in when WTO opened. And then it was German money, all of our good friends. And then finally it was American money. So if you're going to move away from China, if it's going to move someplace else, who's going to fund that? And if it's going to be China funding that, then you're not beating them. So you have to fund that. And our foreign policy, DeSantis, Trump, Biden, doesn't seem to be there. So I don't know. I worry about it. My solution, open the border with Mexico, let them all in, every single one. Everybody in Latin America wants to come here, bring them in. I mean, that's not a great solution, but it's a solution that gives you growth and gives you cheaper. And if you're in a war globally for cheaper, you got to find a cheaper that you can stand better than the cheaper you've got.
Great point.
Great point. As a daughter of a Mexican immigrant, thumbs up to that for sure. All right, so I like how you talked about the long-term game. All three of you touched on China's long-term trajectory, and I think this is so important. We all know China is the world's second largest economy, but on a per capita basis, it's still middle income. So we know this notion of the middle income trap. Is China going to remain in that middle income trap? We've talked about demographics. At least, don't quote me on this, but I'm just trying to picture the chart that we have at our firm. But In terms of the next 10 to 15 years working age population, I think the only economy that's expected to see a larger decline in working age population than China is Japan. So that's not the best country to compare to. I'm sure Russia's now in that mix as well because of what's been happening. Pardon? The Asian tigers are in that as well, exactly. So we've got the demographic downside. We talked about productivity. And Malcolm, it's interesting you brought up the video games. I have a 9-year-old son, and he would have been very upset with taking away video games. But from the economist's perspective, I saw it as a way of being able to allocate tech resources from a less productive source, because hate to say it, video games probably aren't that productive, to a more productive source. So you've got those two aspects of growth. You've got demographics, you've got productivity. That determines their long-term growth potential. Where is that headed for China? What's the end game there?
So I'm going to start this time, and I always hear people talk about the demographics of China and how they're falling apart, and they are. Their birth rate is negative. They'll have a decline in population. There'll be half as many Chinese in 2100 as there are today, et cetera, et cetera. That's also true of some other places. The demographics that bother me, that make me worry, is the fact that from 1940 to 1970, the educational attainment in the United States was extraordinary. And that's what made the baby boom, and that's what made the United States the United States. China is the only country on the planet that has replicated that improvement in education. In 1978, there were no colleges open in China. In 1979, they reopened. From 1979 to now, you've gone from basically 0 to 45% of the population getting a college education. We can argue about the quality of the college education, but they are educating their populace, which means that this demographic wave of these people who are dying, the guy who's dying has a 3rd grade education on average, probably never got beyond the 9th grade because it wasn't beyond the 9th grade when he was that age. The person who's replacing him probably has a college education. So it's not the number of bodies, it's the quality of the bodies. So their productivity is going to continue to rise at a 3, 4, 5% annual rate for as far as the eye can see, with less bodies. So are they going to slow down? Yeah, they're going to slow down because they're probably going to have negative 1% population growth here pretty soon. And even with 4% productivity, you're down to 3. So I worry about that more than their demographic population numbers.
That's a great point, and I'm not a good enough economist to know, but certainly from what I've seen, though, the decline in productivity, I'd like, we should talk about it. I'd like to learn whether or not the college-educated replacement of these guys can increase the productivity, because there also seems to be a decline in the return on investment as well. So I think there's a lot going on there. I would leave this to Lee and my colleagues here as economists, because this is not my area. But the one thing that struck me from what we said is that Xi Jinping made his move for dominance and for moving to the socialist road and for all of these sorts of things that we see him doing. I think he peaked too soon. I don't think the economy was yet in a position where, and we've seen that. We see as soon as he had a shock to the economy, whether it's COVID or it's questions about how to control tech and all these sorts of things, international relations, dealing with the U.S. in terms of restrictions on technology, all these things. It seems as though he made his move too soon, and that's why I tend to agree that he should have waited until he had those college-educated folks in place and had a stronger base to do this from. So far as how the economy is going, I don't have a clue. But that is the one thing that did strike me, that it's way too soon to have made the bold, aggressive moves he did.
Leave it at that? Okay. Oh, how am I doing on time? Because I know because I have a lot more questions, but I want to make sure.
You're literally right on time. First of all, I'd like to thank this great panel, and it's been very stimulating to say the least. But I'm going to do a David Kotok, and I'm going to ask a question, all right? As a military man, the last person in the world that ever wants to see a war is a military man, because they're the first ones to shed blood. We've had a four-star general, General Michael Minahan, who runs the Air Mobility Command, stand up and say publicly that we would be at war with China in 2024. Stunning for me to hear that, because he's active duty. And the fact that he wasn't removed from office and that there was no real blowback, I found just astounding, okay? Very minor blowback, but normally when a military man steps out of line, the commander above him loses faith and confidence and just removes him. He doesn't have to justify it or anything, he just makes the move. We didn't see that. You've actually seen some other civilian leaderships and other notables come out and more or less agree, all right? We've seen in the last couple of weeks where France and Germany have both come on board and said that they would support a peaceful unification with Taiwan and China, which they're NATO countries, all right? So now you're starting to see a fraying inside of NATO. Is there hope? Is there a way to avoid war with China, avoid war with the largest trading country we have, which would be a negative for all the economies involved worldwide? Can we figure out a peaceful solution to this thing way ahead, or is war more or less inevitable?
So I'm going to go out on a limb again, and I'm going to argue that our interest in war with China comes down to technology, and the technology comes down to Taiwan, and the technology in Taiwan comes down to TSMC. The faster we build plants in the United States that replace our dependence on TSMC is the faster that we don't care what happens to Taiwan, and they can take it. So it's going to take 5 years to build those plants. Like COVID, it should take 1 year to build those plants. They should get rid of every regulation in the way and make sure that we can build that stuff in the United States as fast as possible. Because just like we lost interest in the Middle East because we could frack in Texas and all of a sudden we didn't need their oil, we lost interest and we walked away. The same thing will happen in Taiwan. The same thing essentially has already happened in Hong Kong because the financial dependence that we had has gone away. And so we're very upset about it, but we don't do anything about it.
Okay.
I agree with Michael so much. I love it when there's actually something that we disagree on. So this is a good thing. I take Michael's point. I disagree with it for the simple fact that by the time we build these TSMC plants or replacement, that we build up Intel or we create some sort of massive industrial program to create these advanced chips, the fabs in the United States, they're already going to be outdated. TSMC is going to be two generations ahead. By the time these are done, they're going to be older plants at that point. So I do take the argument that as the United States starts shifting its worries to spending too much abroad and et cetera, then the question is, how important is Taiwan? You remember, Taiwan was a legacy security commitment for the United States far before TSMC was a global player. Does that mean that we will have a more robust debate about whether we actually fight the Chinese in the Taiwan Strait or whether we pull back and fight from Guam? But I think the TSMC thing is somewhat overblown. It's a very good reason right now why we have a strategic reason to protect Taiwan, to be involved in Taiwan's defense. But I think that in 5 years the problem's not going to be solved. In 10 years, I don't think the problem could be solved, even with robust industrial policy. And if we did that, there are enormous security disadvantages to allowing China to control the Taiwan Strait. There's enormous blow to U.S. security reputation if we let Taiwan go after half a century of speaking up for it. What is a signal to Japan and Korea? So I think it will make it will be a difficult conversation and will be very hotly debated in the United States if to the extent that TSMC becomes less and less important. But I just think that we have a lot of things there that are not going to be solved in 5 years. They're just going to become hotter topics.
Okay.
Yeah, I can go on both sides of this and find lots of areas to agree. I think the focus on TSMC and semiconductors, though, is misplaced when we look at our reasons for potentially going to war with China. And there's a couple of those. First is let's say that China takes over Taiwan and takes over the fabs intact. just peaceful unification, war, quick war, whatever you want to call it. Those fabs are not working independently. That is, that all the inputs into their production of chips doesn't just happen in Taiwan. It comes from the U.S. It comes from virtually everybody who needs those chips and is designing them elsewhere. And I would assume that if the U.S. went to war with China, or if China took over Taiwan, other than under terms that Taiwan was comfortable with, that those would stop. So TSMC would be a fairly useless acquisition over time. The second point on that would be, I can't imagine the fabs getting through a war. I mean, if nothing else, we'd destroy them. You know, so I'm not quite seeing that's where the issue is. I'm much more in the sense that I think that Lee brought up, and that is that if you consider Taiwan as key to that first island chain that is essentially containing Chinese militarily, that is one of the key reasons. Now, I lived, for example, I'll just give you a personal thing. I lived 11 years 12 years in Taiwan. I was there for the transition from dictatorship to democracy, and it's one of the most thrilling things I've observed in my life. So for me personally, just defending a democracy like that is a lot. But is it worth U.S. blood and treasure to that extent? I don't know. But certainly, I would think strategically, and as Lee said, the impact on our allies would be devastating. Now, here's the thing, though. When she first came into office, for the first 5 years, I was scared. I said, gosh, this guy's got a plan. He's carrying it out. It's extraordinary. I'm watching him do with the anti-corruption campaign, gaining his own control, doing this, doing that. And then in the second time, there's a lot of us who think he's become an incompetent dictator. For a lot of the reasons we talked about earlier, about the errors that we think he made here, that he may not see as errors, but you know, he's kind of got himself into a mess with the technology, with the advanced chip ban, with turning everybody against him. I mean, heck, we supported China's rise for 40 years. I tell my Chinese friends, they say it's all our fault. I say, well, what happened? Why did we suddenly not like China anymore? Well, it's Xi Jinping's aggressive actions, I think, that brought on a lot of it. So I started to think he's not quite as good as I thought. And then I started to wonder, is he as rational as I thought he was? You know, same thing we thought about Putin before he invaded Ukraine. And then I watched a lot of decisions. Like I thought the sudden shift out of zero COVID, and it could be a good policy, bad policy, but there seemed to be no preparation. It seemed to be a whim. And the more power he has, the more autocratic he becomes, the more, even Mao had people around him who prevented him from doing things. I just wonder if this guy just can't act on whim. And if he thinks his whole legacy is based on gaining Taiwan, and he thinks that, and his military people are telling him the same way that apparently Putin's did, that, this will be easy, there could be a war. But I don't think it's going to come from our side or necessarily from our provocative actions. I hope.
Okay, thank you.
Can I propose
All
one
yours.
last
Yep.
fire round? This was a question very provocative question that Malcolm proposed in our prep session. So really quickly, who will be assassinated first? Putin or Xi? And most importantly, would their successors be any different? No pressure.
So my answer is Putin by Xi. Because he goes a little too far.
This was your question.
I'll go ahead and put it Xi Jinping. We've seen these wonderful rumors that go around that Xi's been assassinated. I don't know if you saw that. If you follow China closely, you see you'll see the air traffic stopped. All these sorts of things. They didn't show Xi shows up, but there's no real way other than that anymore. The factions are gone. And so anybody who disagrees with policy, I think he's more vulnerable, and I think Putin seems to be so well protected that I'm not sure the bad guys can get to him.
Putin.
I'm not on the panel, but I would have said Putin a year ago. I'm not so sure anymore. He's lasted a lot longer than I thought. I would have thought an oligarch or a military guy would have gotten to him somehow or another. But very interesting question. Can I throw North Korea's dictator in that? Because there's another one that's a true despot. Well, to our panel, thank you so much. Hold on, one question from the audience. Here comes the mic.
This sort of touches a little bit on that last question, but one thing we haven't really talked about is sort of the internal dynamics and the population within China. And for the past 45 years, U.S. policy has been driven by a thinking that what keeps the Chinese leadership up at night the most is does it in fact maintain total control over its population. And you really saw this come to a head at Tiananmen Square when you had the big fallout between Deng Xiaoping and Zhao Ziyang. And I guess my question is, with 400,000 students now being educated in the U.S., with less walls around the world, and also the big thing they worried about was economic growth. So as long as the population is getting richer, everything was fine. If you have structural long-term, potential downturn, what does that mean about the population? And is it possible the population will say enough of Xi? I mean, you sort of touched on it. He's got control, but I don't know. What do you think about that as a factor?
So I'll go. My wife is Iranian. She came out in 1972. Most of her family still lived in Iran in 1979 when the revolution started. I've been hearing stories for 40 years about how they're going to overthrow the government in Iran, and it's way, way more oppressive than anything that goes on in China, and they didn't make them rich. So, I mean, Venezuela, there's lots of places in the world that are not fun. And the idea that people are going to be like Americans and just rise up and fight, it's not the nature, that's not the Chinese nature. The fact that 90% of their students return home tells me something. Plus, you have these vettings. I mean, Hong Kong's a city of 7 million people. 75,000 have left in the last year, and they were the elites. So who's left? People who don't complain about what's going on. So I'm not a big believer that there'll be an overthrow of Xi from that sense. Now, where will there be an overthrow from Xi? He's 10 years older than everybody else in power, and there's a gap. So there's a next leader of China, and he's in that next group. He's 45 or 50 or 60, I don't know. And is he going to wait patiently for Xi to be president another 20 years? Or is he, because there's not going to, they're going to retire the next group out at 65 too. So that gap is going to keep getting wider and wider. And at some point, somebody's going to want to be in charge.
I'll go ahead and take if you look at Chinese history, regime change of dynasty has come sometimes through palace coup, through assassination of the emperor, but also through rebellion. And we've seen throughout Chinese history, governments toppled by uprisings. We saw one of the greatest ones, the Taiping Rebellion, which apparently killed 20 or 30 million people and took over a great part of China, almost right to the doorstep of Shanghai. So I've coined a phrase, and that is the Chinese people are very patient until they're not. And so I don't know what that point is with the Xi Jinping or the Chinese Communist Party, where it's not. But here's a problem, and that is that we mentioned earlier that the Chinese Communist Party is a Leninist party, and they did succeed through revolution. They know that any kind of freedom of association, freedom of speech, freedom of communication can be a political danger. And so we've seen unbelievable measures taken to prevent that kind of association among people who have dissenters from of the regime, from being able to communicate, or even be able to publish an essay in criticism. And that degree of control and technology that she has gives me a sense that if the Chinese are patient until they're not, even if they're not, are we in a technological age and an age of such incredible security in China that even if they wanted to organize and rebel, they couldn't?
I'll answer this very quickly. Anything could happen. There's no evidence I'm aware of that she is under any type of real duress. But the thing to keep in mind is this. We don't know what's going on behind the scenes, but we do know that the nature of the system over the last several years has been that she has gained more and more power, and there's been more specific identification of Xi Jinping with China, with the Communist Party, and with the Chinese economy. Xi Jinping thoughts on the Constitution. These are Xi's fingerprints on everything from Belt and Road to the way the Chinese economic model is changing. As you go through a slowdown going forward, you have rising global tensions, you have problems with export controls and not being able to do all the things commercially and technologically you'd might like to do because you've made a lot of enemies. These are stresses on the system. And in a Western democracy, there's a solution to this. You throw the bum out. And then you get the next guy, you get tired of him, you throw the bum out. And it's a pressure valve on the system. A one-party state does not have that pressure valve. And so we don't know what's happening behind the scenes right now. It doesn't look like there's a problem. There may not be a problem. It may be slow steam for a long, long time. But the problem is without that pressure valve, a one-party state is at a severe disadvantage in terms of its sustainability because there's no one else to blame. And what she has done is create a universe in which there truly is no one else to blame because she is everything in China right now. So I think anyone who's calling for the revolution or a coup or something is just sort of throwing that out there without any evidence. On the other hand, structurally, this creates a real question mark going forward. And how can you resist what's going to be a growing pressure, even if they do everything right?
Yep. Okay. Thank you so much for an absolutely stimulating conversation. I think we could go for hours with this one. And it's proven again that what we thought about last September was by looking at China was the right thing to do. To our moderator, thank you so much. You did a wonderful job up here. Leland, thank you so much. Malcolm and Michael, we really appreciate it. Now, David. What's that?
Since I staggered in here, can I get a last minute question?
All yours.
Thank you. Surgery and an anesthesia to lessen pain combined are wonderful things as long as the anesthesia lasts. So it's a local, so I hope it didn't reach here. I'm sorry I missed this panel. There was a reason. I'd like to try a question since I know the agenda today is a little changed because of a person who couldn't participate. So I'd like to try a different type of question. We have 3 China experts. 2 of them are economists. I don't know what Malcolm is. I just know Malcolm for a long time. He's a Sarasotan.
Sarasota boy.
We have the chief global economist of a very prestigious firm, and they're all Global Interdependence Center members. In this world of sanction war, penalty, is there a path for positive interdependence, not growing negative interdependence? Can you give this audience suggestions that are practical, that are incentives to change behavior rather than pressure or forces to change behavior? And I look at history and I say, we've had sanctions since Castro in Cuba. What have they accomplished? What are the ratcheting up of pressure accomplishing except the growth of the negative interdependencies? Is there a path for Ronald Reagan to achieve a change in behavior in Russia from a Gorbachev, a reversal? Is there a positive, or is the outlook so bleak that positive interdependencies based on incentives are just not attainable? So there's 4 experts for that question.
I can start quickly. So a lot of it is taking some of the things we've learned today, but I think the force of capitalism is incredibly strong. As I mentioned before, businesses at the end of the day want to make money, and unless there are too many restrictions on an individual country's part, whether it's industrial policy, high broad-based tariffs, I think there is going to be a natural continuation of globalization. And if there are certain sanctions, say, put against China and Russia, people find a way. Even China's found a way, which is pretty significant. But you're just going to go to the next lowest cost producer. So I'm not super pessimistic about the globalization story just because of the ingenuity of humans. I think from a United States perspective, I think it's so important to maintain just strong State Department ties, allies, military ties to show that we're out there to help the rest of the world, because at the end of the day, if China doesn't want anything to do with us and does want to separate, we want as many people possible on our side. So that would be my proposed solution.
I would say that strong interdependencies can coexist with strong sanctions. I think that thoughtful China policy going forward from the United States is going to require a very strong, limited list of priorities that we take very seriously and we drive much harder than we have before, with sanctions on advanced technology being the top of that list. On the other hand, making sure that we understand that the goal of the United States, the goal of U.S. foreign policy should not be the destruction of China's economy, should not be trying to slow China's economy down in a broad sense. What we should be doing is prioritizing where we think that there are national security problems here. And I think that the advanced technologies, there's a very strong reason why we're putting this ring fencing around China for that. But it doesn't mean that we need to be attacking China's economy as a goal of U.S. foreign policy. So if we can create a priority list, stick to that priority list and take that priority list very seriously and not letting the relationship drift in other areas then you can have a situation where we avoid war, where we continue to stay coupled, and we continue to have a tense but working relationship with China. I hope that that's the baseline going forward, but there's a lot of things that could go wrong.
No chance. I see right now the situation is implacable. She sees the U.S. as his major threat, and at the same time she sees him as the leader who's going to bring China back to the prominence it had a couple hundred years ago when China was the Middle Kingdom. And he's not, and in his interpretation of U.S. actions, even our most benign, seem to be that we have a hostility, and that seems to be also what the Chinese people understand as well. On the U.S. side, as long as China takes aggressive actions against countries that we consider allies or friends, whether it's Australia because they called for a COVID investigation, or it's Taiwan, which is certainly one of the biggest flashpoint that an unresolvable issue. I don't see any way around it. The one thing that could happen is you could have a conjunction of the 3 things that Reagan had. First was many administrations adapting Kennan's view of containment and enforcing it in ways that Kennan didn't necessarily think were part of his policy, but that were effective in preventing, in allowing Russia to the Soviet Union to sort of collapse under its own weight of its own contradictions. But for that to happen, you needed a Reagan and a Gorbachev. And so far, I don't see Xi as a Gorbachev, And goodness knows, I don't see anything close to a Ronald Reagan anywhere. So I'm not seeing the sort of personal ways of resolving it. I'm not seeing the containment in the sense that it worked with the Soviet Union can be effective given the interdependency that we've talked about here. And as long as the hostility exists really on both sides, I don't see a middle ground on virtually anything.
So I'm going to echo Alejandra's view that capitalism wins every time. I saw a great piece on LinkedIn the other day of Milton Friedman explaining a pencil, and how everything in the pencil came from someplace, and that the people who contributed everything didn't really like each other in a lot of cases, but money brought them together to create a pencil. And to me, it's not what the politicians think. I unfortunately believe that the reason that we have the political leaders that we have in the United States and that they're clowns, frankly, is because they don't matter. If they were important, we would pick important people, but they don't matter. What does matter is that Tim Cook is in India opening the first Apple store in India. And he's going to bring capitalism to India because the Indians are capitalists. And they've been in their own way for a long time, but when you finally show them how to make a lot of money, like really, really fast, they'll figure it out and they'll be on your side. So my question is, how do you control China? Is you find the alternative. You go to Mexico, you go to Latin America, you go to Southeast Asia, you go to Indonesia, to Malaysia, you find these places that are alternatives. Let the Chinese build them. Use their money. That's what happened in China. The Japanese built China for us, and then they lost, because in the end we took over. So let capitalism work. Let capitalism find cheaper. It's not in China anymore. It's someplace else. So let us find cheaper, and the faster that we get to cheaper, the faster we'll move away from a dependency on China.
Third time's a charm, I'm sure. Again, to the panel, this has been amazing. It really has, Alex. Thank you so much for doing this and moving the clock forward for us. All right. Okay, so we're going to take a quick 5-minute break. And we're going to come back, and Jonathan Ward is going to talk to us about China from his perspective, and then we'll do a book signing after that. So let's take 5 for a nature break and a coffee refill, and we'll be back here at 10:30. Okay. Thank you very much.
The GIC welcomes Jonathan, who has been with us before, and Kelly Caldwell, who has been with us on a trip to Cuba, and a few years ago we didn't know each other, and now we know each other, we do business together, he knows the GIC, and we grow closer. So let me turn the program over to you, Kelly, to introduce the whole thing.
Thank you, David. It has been enjoyable getting to know you, and it's amazing what you guys do to promote goodwill across the country and across the world. So with that, I'm here. My name is Kelly Caldwell. I'm CEO of Caldwell Trust Company. We're a local independent trust company managing money. And I had the fortune of getting to know Jonathan Ward over the last couple of years. First, I saw him on Maria Bartiromo, and I said, oh my gosh, I've been worried about this, and this guy is telling the story the way it needs to be told. So he is also the principal of the Atlas organization. He's the author of 2 books. Again, the one book we just talked about, The Decisive Decade, is coming out next Tuesday, this coming Tuesday, I should say. So congratulations, you get it firsthand if you get it here. And then, of course, The Vision of Victory is his first book from approximately, I think, 2019? Okay. So before we jump into this, though, I think it's important because I was sitting with him on Wednesday night, and he told me something that I did not know. And I asked him, how did you get this background of China expert? How did you get the ability to know all this information? And then you started telling this story, and I thought, it is so important to share that before people start to hear your plans, for you to share that, because it is unique, and I guess it's undoable today.
Sure. So, yeah, I guess my background as a China specialist is it's about 20 years in the making now. On one hand, I did Russian and Chinese language at Columbia University as an undergrad, but then spent a lot of time traveling all over China by bicycle, by truck, by railroad. Hitchhiked around Xinjiang and Tibet in truck caravans, and did a lot of things that you simply would not be able to do now. I mean, even at the time, there were certain risks involved, but today those sorts of travels I think are no longer possible. And then one of the other things that we were discussing the other night was, as a PhD student at Oxford, I had access to the diplomatic archives of the People's Republic of China in Beijing, which have all been shut down and closed to the world. So my entire doctorate was based on Chinese documents that are no longer available, and which was its own sort of adventure. And so seeing those different sides of China, on one hand having the immersion in language all over rural China, sort of small cities, not just being, let's say, in an office park in Shanghai or Beijing or Hong Kong, but really going out and listening to people and asking how they saw things. I mean, that gave me contact with the country that I think was incredibly valuable and probably much harder to do now. And then the archival work and that kind of thing is simply no longer possible. And they actually shut them down while I was there, and they said it was a system update. And I thought about changing my flights and stuff, but they've been closed ever since. So I managed to collect what I needed all over the country as I went, and got to see some sides of China that are probably no longer viewable.
And I think that's just invaluable when you start to read your books. And their first book was The Vision of Victory. And I think before we again jump into your current book, or one that's about to come out, can you explain to us what is China's vision of victory?
Right. So China's vision of victory, I mean, it's the thing that I wanted to convey with the first book, and the reason I wrote it was I was very concerned that the United States and our allies were not going to get the picture on China. I mean, we were in a world where everyone was talking about trading with China, doing business with China, the peaceful rise of China, responsible stakeholder, all this sort of stuff that I think today we know is not true. And to me, as a historian of modern China who'd been working on the first 20 years of the People's Republic of China, and as someone who'd spent plenty of time in the country and later was working for the U.S. Department of Defense as a consultant on basically the future vision of the Communist Party. What do they intend to do? Where do they intend to go? I thought it was really important to put all the primary documents in front of American readers. So taking Communist Party strategy documents and getting them in front of tens of thousands of Americans was, I think, the achievement of the first book. And, it was had an impact in Washington and on U.S. strategy and policy towards China. But, most importantly, showing people that we're dealing with something that's incredibly deep, incredibly long-standing. It's not just Xi Jinping. I think Xi Jinping gave a wake-up call to the world, but in fact, the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, which is what it's officially called, the view of China becoming the dominant power in the world. This is a view that goes all the way back to the beginning. I mean, Mao Zedong, when he founded the People's Republic of China and declared that the Chinese people had stood up and that there would be a new China that would no longer accept the humiliation and predations of foreign empires and nations, he began that trajectory that the rest of the party has inherited. And then Mao himself believed he was an heir to Sun Yat-sen and the May 4th movement and all these other elements of Chinese nationalism that were about returning China to a position of power. And China's vision of victory shows both the history of that idea, but also, pretty much all of its contemporary and modern strategies. So from the Belt and Road to Made in China 2025 to civil military fusion, this is happening in a global economy. I mean, it's not just an esoteric vision from a Leninist party that is, on some kind of post-Cold War delusion. It's something that's being executed. I mean, Michael Drew is talking about the massive trade surplus that China's running and then therefore reinvesting in foreign aid all around the world, the domination of strategic industries, the pursuit of critical technologies, and the buildup of a military that is specifically designed for combat with the United States in the Indo-Pacific. Those are all the features. So this book takes the reader on a sort of encyclopedic tour of, on one hand, Chinese grand strategy in their own words, but also all the elements. I mean, from subsea to outer space to Africa to India. I mean, how does the whole grand vision work? And we're dealing with this, and we're never going to stop dealing with it until we find a way to defeat these strategies. And that's what I put out in the Decisive Decade. We have to work from the real strategies that they're using, and we have to dismantle them. And we don't have much time, which is why the clock is running out. In Vision of Victory, I wrote that for them, there's the symbolic date of 2049 when it's the 100-year anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic, and that's when the Great Rejuvenation is complete. But for us, this is really about 2030. If we don't get our act together, all of the big stuff will happen by then, and they will have built the foundation for the kind of geopolitics that will, be really. We don't want to live in that world. So we have to get this done in the 2020s. For America, we win or lose by 2030, I think.
When you actually look at it, they've been working at it way longer than we give it credit for. And it's only like COVID, TikTok, spy balloons, recent events that kind of have galvanized the government. Even the reliance or the alliance with the Ukraine war, bringing Russia and China together, has finally got people to pay attention. So while your first book seems like it's that canary in the coal mine, the second book details how to do it. You detail 4 areas: an economics, a military, a battle of ideas, and the third one is the diplomatic one. Can you just briefly tell us what each of those areas means? I know we're going to get into the economic one pretty significantly, but what do the 4 areas mean?
Absolutely. So I framed the new book. The bottom line is we need a new American grand strategy, and we need to basically form our strategy around the central geopolitical problem of our lifetimes, which is the rise of a hostile authoritarian China that's bent on, ultimately becoming the top power and creating a world that is led and dominated by the CCP. They're quite serious about that, and I think we need to realize that in order to proceed. So I've framed it in terms of the sort of classical American and Western view of grand strategy, that it's broken into 4 parts. And I call them arenas in this case. So, the economic arena, the diplomatic arena, the military arena, and then the arena of ideas. We're going to have to win in each of these domains in order to successfully have a counterpoint to the CCP global strategy. They don't necessarily think of it in those terms, but we should. It's going to be helpful for us. And, I still think that this is a contest that can be won or will be lost based on our ability to outcompete the People's Republic of China as an economic superpower. We built the People's Republic of China. In the 1980s, it was essentially an agrarian nation. Today, it's a superpower that is matching us or leading us in anything from quantum to AI to, hypersonics to, you name it. And then has also become 30% of the world's industrial base in terms of value. Those used to be, we used to be the sleeping giant. And, I talk a bunch about World War II and the role of our businesses. We've let this all go through globalization. So we're going to have to regain the economic initiative. We have to become, and we have to remain the world's largest and most dynamic economy. And we cannot cede that position. That's the story of pretty much every power in history. That's our story. After World War II, we were 50% of global GDP. Now we're about 25%. We've been as high as 35%, 30 years ago, but we're going to have to regain that delta and get back to a greater share of global economy. The military arena, I think the 2 most important things from a pure sort of grand strategy perspective are the economics and the military. We have to, have the economic power to finance and sustain real deterrence. The real picture here, and I'm sorry that our Air Force general was not able to make it today. I think that would have been a very clear explanation of what's going on in the Pacific. The military balance has changed dramatically, and we have to change it back. We're going to have to be able to have real deterrence, which means showing Xi Jinping and that on any given day, any of his plans are not going to work. That's going to be very important. Otherwise, as we see, and as someone who speaks Russian and Chinese and nearly did a doctorate in Russia-China relations before doing China-India instead, Putin went ahead. These dictators do roll the iron dice, and we have to make it clear that will be a failure. But we're not there yet. So we need the economic power to sustain overwhelming deterrent capacity together with our allies in the Indo-Pacific. And then diplomatically, we have to have a global strategy. China has a global strategy. That was one of the things that I tried to make very clear in China's Vision of Victory. And I did that as someone who was not just a China specialist, but lived and traveled all over the world for over 10 years, including my PhD, but also many years of traveling in China, India, Latin America, Middle East, learning different languages and dialects, and dedicating myself to understanding sort of where things were going all around the planet through the language capacity and ability to go and immerse, in rural and urban environments and such. So, you look at just the past week. I mean, from Macron going to Beijing, to Lula going over. I mean, this is absolutely a global picture. To China's defense minister going to Russia. I mean, it's a global strategy. It's not just about Asia. So we need to rebuild. We need a concept of how to restructure world order, and I've laid out how we do that. I mean, what would it look like? We're going to need the economic power to do that, the military power for deterrence, a global vision, and I think that's where our diplomacy matters. I mean, how do we engage the emerging world? How do we consolidate the alliance system to deal with this challenge from both Moscow and Beijing? And then finally, the arena of ideas, where, why does this even matter? I mean, what is the difference between whether it's an American and allied-led world or it's a world that's led by Putin and Xi Jinping? I mean, that's why this matters. I thought I was going to be a humanitarian doctor in India and Africa when I was an undergraduate. And then, I sort of joke that I'm the only person that, on one hand, has worked in a mission hospital in India and has also briefed U.S. Strategic Command. So, my priorities changed once I realized the nature of, what we're dealing with. So we have to win the arena of ideas. Our ideals and values are our greatest strength, and it's why the whole thing matters.
Recently, Secretary Yellen just suggested in a speech that we need to be mindful of the national securities, but irrespective of that, we can still have a healthy and ongoing economic relationship with China. Given your book and your outline, is that actually reasonable? Is that doable?
Yes, so I think we had a major moment yesterday when Secretary Janet Yellen, Secretary of the Treasury, gave her speech on U.S.-China relations, and it was a speech that was in a way all over the place, and I think it shows that we don't actually have a clear grand strategy, and that's what we badly need. And the premise of this book, in a way, is that you cannot have your national security and have your business interests in China as well. I mean, we're not dealing with a Gorbachev in China or even a Khrushchev in China. We're dealing with something that's much more ambitious, much more dangerous, much more brutal. I mean, this is a state that's carrying out a genocide that's been proven by researchers all around the world. It's a state that's building a military that's designed for not only conflict with us, but with other neighbors in the region. It's a dictator that talks about preparing to fight and win wars. It is a nation state ruled by a party that fought wars with many of its neighbors in the 20th century, despite telling us all about the peaceful rise of China. And because of our business interests, we generally believed that, I think, in many capitals. But bottom line, this is a country that's preparing for conflict, carrying out a genocide, has some of the worst human rights records in history. I mean, the party itself has probably killed more people than any regime in history, if you add the Mao years up, and that's well known. So one of the big questions is, why are we doing business with this place? And why are we doing business to the point that we have offshored our industrial base to our primary adversary? We've participated in the financing of their military buildup. Our technology has wound up in their human rights atrocities. And for them, they're just getting started. So I think that's where we have to go. In order to win this contest, we must win the economic arena. And that means two things fundamentally. One is economic containment of China while we can still do that. The rise of China has really been about their access to Western markets, capital, and technology. All we have to do is start scaling that back, reducing that, and we start to slow it down. And if you start to slow it down, then the military ascendancy, sort of goes backwards as well. I mean, what we can't do is continue to finance the rise of their geopolitical strategies. And then on the other hand, you have to rebuild the United States. We're going to have to focus on our industrial base. We're going to have to focus on our allies and friends and ensure that we have an economic community that can balance and offset any possible objectives that Beijing may have. For example, the U.S. alliance system alone, NATO alone, is half of world GDP. You add the world's democracies together, and it's 65%. You take global wealth. The U.S. is net $127 trillion in wealth. You add the allies and democracies together, it's about $350 trillion. But we have to consolidate that. That has to be our community. So our globalization, I think, as somebody who has lived and traveled globally, who learned many, many languages, who studied global history at great university and all that, I mean, I'm in favor for that with your friends. with your partners, but not with your adversaries and not those who mean to do harm to the entire picture. And that's what we have to get right. So I think Yellen's speech was not only off the mark, but a real misstep, because there's been, I think, a very strong bipartisan direction in in Washington now, focused around the issues posed by China. But what we don't yet have is an economic strategy. And Treasury and Commerce are likely to be our most important departments if we are going to successfully win a global economic competition. But first we need to understand that the growth and rise of the People's Republic of China, as long as the Communist Party is in power, is definitely harmful, not only to us, but to our allies and friends in Asia and around the world.
Given our lack of strategy, as you explained there, and clearly they have a strategy, they call it the Belt and Road Initiative, and they've been pursuing that for quite some time. They're also coupling that with removing the dollar as a U.S. world currency, the U.S. dollar as a world currency. I just had a question about the containment. To win this battle, does the dollar have to retain its U.S. world currency status, or is that an indication that we are losing the war?
Sure. So de-dollarization, I think, is a very popular topic right now, and what better place to address it? And as some of my friends in the audience who really are experts on that subject have told me, we shouldn't worry about this. I mean, that's the good news. I mean, there are always, we go through these moments where people worry about de-dollarization, and I think today, it is going to be incredibly important for the dollar to remain the reserve currency. I mean, we need to have sanctions power. That's going to be one of the biggest pieces of economic containment. The effectiveness of sanctions on Russia and the coordination with our allies to do that, to sanction major banks, to remove them from SWIFT. I mean, all of this has actually definitely been a real cost to Putin and to his invasion. And it's one of the things that probably gives China pause when they look at their own options in Taiwan. They understand that if we're able to work together as allies, if we're able to utilize all that potential, the economic costs would be incredibly dangerous to them. But it's still 60% of central bank reserves. It's 90%, I believe, of all global transactions, and the RMB is 3% of central bank reserves, and an equally sort of small portion of global transactions. But as Michael is pointing out, whoever wins the battle for trade, that historically has been a major part of how power works. So we're not yet playing the game for trade. I don't think we have a full spectrum trade strategy that would integrate the alliance system the way we want to and win the major contests in the emerging world. I mean, we need to be working on economic engagement with major rising nations from India to Brazil to Nigeria to Indonesia. The Belt and Road is designed to tie the continents, basically the entire Eurasian, African, Australian, Indian Ocean supercontinental structure, back to China, with China as the economic center. And they envision multiple maritime corridors and Silk Roads, as they call them, all of which will be defended by military power. They've made that all clear. I laid it out in the first book. And we need to make sure that we're playing the game in the emerging world, getting our companies in, getting our Exim Bank to a much larger degree. I think we'll probably need a U.S. and allied sovereign wealth fund to do some of the infrastructure work that's necessary to get our companies and banks engaged, but with a little more long-term strategic direction from U.S. government. And then we're going to have to go essentially into economic battle with Chinese corporations. And, the book is H.R. McMaster, former National Security Advisor, wrote the introduction to the book and addressed it to the business leaders of the free world, because one thing that I think is essential here is that our businesses come into alignment with our national security. If we continue to run in two directions, and I think unfortunately Janet Yellen's speech suggested that we can run in two directions and somehow move forward, I don't think that's true at all. And in fact, the Second World War was it was the power of our companies, of our industrial base, of mobilizing it, that allowed us to prevail. We had 3 times the combined power of Germany and Japan together in the 1930s. And then in the Cold War, our technological advantages, our innovation system allowed us to, just have such a great economic lead over the Soviet Union at all times that we could sustain a global strategy. We could ultimately go through the Reagan years and, produce the peaceful outcome to the Cold War because of economic power. But today, we're in a spot where our companies are tied into the China market, and their companies, the Chinese companies, are working directly for the Communist Party of China to service national strategic goals, from the Belt and Road to civil military fusion to the human rights abuses. And I've detailed that all a lot with information that's rarely gathered in one place. So we have to be able to play that game, and we have to be able to play it globally. And I think we need to see our major companies win in global markets in ways that will offset our Chinese competitors. And I also think we should be unafraid to take real action against, for example, the Chinese companies that are fusing together the Russia-China relationship. The Russia-China axis is being built by, essentially economic relations. China has, essentially backed economically the Russian war in Ukraine, and its companies are all there. Yale has done some great work on who's in, who's out, and the Chinese companies are, continue to be working very deeply into the Russian market. So we should be, there's so many things you can do when it comes to sanctions and economic containment and economic actions. So I think there's some target sets that we should be unafraid to use.
You use the word allies, which has reminiscent of World War II and the wars. We know who our natural allies should be. Who are the ones that are on the bubble? And I'm specifically referring to India and others that might be on the bubble that we need to be aware of. And then how do they play a role for us going forward?
Yes, so this contest is largely going to be won by, economic power, the strength of our alliance system, and the ability to produce deterrence. If we can get all of those right, I think we're going to be fine. Then time comes back to our side as opposed to running away from us, which it is now. And we have a brilliant alliance system from Europe to Asia and many countries in between. This has to be consolidated. And I think turned into more of an economic community. We want to be working with the OECD industrial democracies to essentially secure supply chains, ensure that strategic industries are, essentially in the lead is with the free nations, and then also that the critical technologies are going to be ones where we're winning that contest. But we are going to have countries that, if you think about the Cold War world, where you had two blocks and then the third element to it was the non-aligned movement. And the non-aligned movement was initially China and India came together in 1954 and said, we're going to lead the world together and provide an alternative route for emerging nations. And, 10 years later, there was the China-India border war. So that collapsed, and then China sort of attacked India and used all the diplomatic relations that India had built for it in Asia and Africa to engage in diplomatic warfare against India. I think we're about to have a repeat of that. We gave China access to the global economy, and we're not far from seeing the similar consequences for ourselves. But bottom line, we're going to need to, I think, focus on India. As Churchill said about FDR, no one has studied another place as carefully as I have studied America, because I know how important it is to this. I think if India is able to swing to the side of the free world, that could decide the entire contest just based on their economic potential, their geography, and the fact that we could really have a values-based cornerstone to rebuilding global order. But we have to work on the economic relationship. There's something in Washington that's called Mission 500. Washington and Delhi talk about this once in a while, just how to build U.S.-India trade to 500 billion. It's about 150 now. Can you really bring supply chains there? Can you find sort of domestic demand-driven business reasons to base manufacturing or other business initiatives? All of that, if there's a demand-driven alternative to China, that's going to be very powerful. We're not there yet, but I think we'll get some of it out of India and Southeast Asia. And then I think other nations like Indonesia, which is already a $1 trillion economy, it was also part of the non-aligned movement throughout the Cold War and is a very independent state in that sense. On the other hand, I've personally been up in the South China Sea on an Indonesian cargo ship going through the Natuna Islands that are claimed by the Chinese military. So, they have their own geopolitical issues with China. And as long as we can provide economic alternatives and a clear vision of diplomatic order that's inclusive and beneficial to states like India, Indonesia, and others in the emerging world, I think we'll have the means to engage them and to bring them onto our side. People know the consequences of Beijing's economic and military dominance in the Indo-Pacific. And then this goes much more broadly. I think Brazil is incredibly important. I mean, when we talk about de-dollarization, it's Lula who has said every night I go to sleep wondering why does the world rely on the U.S. dollar? I mean, this is not good. So we need to be much more focused on Latin America and also in Africa. I mean, China's building supply chains in Africa that we can't even contemplate. I just learned that Huawei apparently has well over 10,000 sales representatives in the continent of Africa. I mean, do we have anything equivalent? Are our companies and businesses and banks taking Africa's rise seriously or Africa's potential? We're going to have to be in many, many places. And what's often said about U.S.-China relations is we can't be everywhere that China is. We can't match China dollar for dollar. That may be true, but the alliance system can. The alliance system can be everywhere, and the alliance system can match China dollar for dollar. We can overmatch China dollar for dollar. So that's how we have to restructure. We have to consolidate the free world and then pull as many emerging markets and emerging nations as we can to our side and offset Beijing's vision of victory.
As you can tell, we could spend the entire rest of the afternoon talking with him on this subject, but I am going to be mindful of the clock. I'm going to end my question with one last question that we spoke about Wednesday night, and then we do have time for one or two questions from the audience, so I'm just giving you a heads up on that. So in the 70s, when Nixon opened up China and Kissinger went over there, and it was the awakening. Was that a mistake that we did that? And is there going to be another one of those opportunities for us in the future that will help us? Or was that the mistake that we can't put the genie back in the bottle?
Well, I think, yes, and even Nixon questioned it at the time. There's some really interesting passages that I included in China's Vision of Victory where he sort of doubts what he's done, and it's almost like a Shakespearean moment where he says, to Kissinger or someone around him, Henry, what have we done? Is this the right thing? That sort of thing. And I think it is not looking good now. I mean, the opening to China in the context of the Cold War, to flip. Henry Kissinger told my supervisor at Oxford, who's one of the leading China scholars in the world, he told him at one point on British radio that the reason they went to China was because they were concerned that the Soviet Union would install a pro-Soviet regime in Beijing. And at that point, there'd already been a short border war in the Amur River Valley in 1969, the Sino-Soviet border war. So the opening moment was clear. And I think making that shift in the context of the Cold War world made sense at the logic of that time. But what didn't make sense, I think, was for us to let the whole tape run for, 40 or 50 years and not check the results until 5 years ago, let's say. I mean, we have known about the human rights abuses. I mean, Tiananmen Square should have been an important moment in our consideration of trade with China and our consideration of investment with China and working with the Communist Party. I mean, I think those ghosts are back to haunt us now. I mean, we've, mainlined capital and technology and, global market access to a state that murdered, thousands of its own citizens carrying the goddess of democracy. I mean, this is that's the China we should have been working with somehow. It's how do you find that? And that exists today in Taiwan. The democratic vision and sort of version of this is not in Beijing, and we empowered that. And I think we're, unless we get our act together, we're likely to pay for that in ways that I think would make Kissinger and Nixon regret their work. But we still have this time, I think, to rebuild a genuine American and allied strategy that can succeed. And we have to focus on economic power. We have to get our business leaders involved. We have to think globally. We have to work with the allies, and we have to focus on our values and recognize why this matters, and do away with our illusions about what we've brought into the world by empowering a regime like this. We can still win, but the time is somewhat brief.
All right. Do we have any questions we want to take from the audience real quick? Yeah.
So bear with me on this, Jonathan. So when we were in Rocky Mountain Economic Summit a couple of years ago, Greg and I were having a conversation with a gentleman from D.C., and somehow the word deep state came up. And he said, the deep state exists, it's just not what you think it is. And I think Greg and I are still scratching our heads over what that is. But you talk about strategy and defeating strategy. Sun Tzu, Art of War, it's not defeating your enemy, it's defeating your enemy's strategy. So you have to know what your enemy's strategy is. So you don't want to announce your strategy if you have one. And I do wonder, you and I were talking about, I did some work with the Department of Energy, and it was right before 2012, it was 2011, and we were looking at a long-term project, and we're sitting with some people saying the new administration may change, what we decide to do as this long-term project. And the people sitting in the room said, we're on the B team, not the letter B, but BE. It says, we will be here after the next administration. Actually gave me some hope that we talk about our 4-year strategy with the new president, and she's got a 50-year strategy. And I hope that maybe in the State Department or that somewhere else that there's some longer-term strategy. Maybe we don't announce it. I mean, you're probably closer to it than anybody else, but something that actually gave me hope is Nancy Pelosi's trip to Taiwan. And I don't know if anybody saw the fleet of planes that went over. Was quite an impressive demonstration. I think it was more signaling. It was just excessive number of jets that flew over to Taiwan. And now Kevin McCarthy's going. So I think that there is some, it seems to me that there's some evidence that there is some sort of coherent bipartisan strategy that maybe we don't know about. You're closer to it, but is there any hope there, Jonathan?
Look, I think there's plenty of reasons to have hope about this. I mean, one, the potential of the United States is so great, and that's really, to me, what this is about. I mean, I'm trained as a historian of modern Asia, and it's really America that I'm learning anew, even though I obviously am American. But, it's really about, are we going to be able to hit the next high notes in sort of economic history? Can we go through the fourth industrial revolution and make giant gains in productivity? Can we, work with the democracies? Can we rebuild things? I think Washington is a reason. The bipartisan focus on China is absolutely a reason to believe that we are headed in the right direction. If we weren't there, we'd be in so much more trouble. And we weren't there when the first book came out. So that's back when I was more concerned about that. But the changes in Washington, I think, have been very good. I actually concluded part of the book with Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, because I think that was about the values side. I mean, Taiwan it's the military balance in the Indo-Pacific. I mean, the geography is incredibly important. It's semiconductors, and that is actually pretty hard to overstate how significant that is. But then it's also values. I mean, the ramparts of the free world are in Ukraine and Taiwan. I mean, that's just where we are. I mean, these are democracies that are being threatened by authoritarian dictatorships because they believe that they can do it. And we have to show that we're engaged, that we're serious, and that we're going to provide the counterpoint. And, I think it's great to see both Pelosi and McCarthy congratulating each other on what they're doing, which is values-based work. Now, what we need behind that is a real attention to military power. We are going to have to put our get that act together, so to speak, and then economic power to support the military power. I mean, that's the fundamental foundation. I do think this is a question of, not will China rise, but will America rise? I mean, do we have a second wind? Are we a country that can also look to 2030 and 40 and 50 and beyond and, make all of the gains that are on the horizon in the 21st century and ensure that those are, the gains of the free world? I mean, Putin and Xi Jinping have told us their visions of AI and quantum and space and all of that. I mean, it's extensive how they've thought about that for the goal of strategic power. But we need to win those games. We need to win them all, or as many as we possibly can. And we need to do it while we have time. So I am hopeful about America. But the one thing is, I wrote in this book that my concern now is that Washington, D.C. versus the People's Republic of China is a game that we are going to lose. But the United States of America versus the People's Republic of China is something completely different. And that's why I think we need our business leaders and we need Wall Street to go through the same enlightenment that Washington has. Jamie Dimon gave the first hint of that. I did not expect that, but his shareholder letter, this past month sounded a whole lot like parts of my book about rebuilding the US having a global economic strategy. I thought that was an extraordinary moment from somebody who's in power in the economic world, as opposed to someone out who's seeking political office or something. So we need our CEOs to be engaged, and we need our citizens to be engaged. And then we can do this. And then that needs to go across, we have many great allies, from Britain to Japan to Australia to you name it. So you bring the world together, and America has to lead.
Thank you, Jonathan. It was a wonderful conversation, and I know he's going to be around for a little bit more, so you can continue your questions then. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Let's thank this panel. Thank you, Kelly. Thank you, Jonathan. This is the modification of the schedule. And let me see if I get it right. We're going to hear from Nayantara Hensel. Nay, come on up. And we're going to have a different picture of a defense-oriented subject. Do you want the microphone or you want the panel? You've got slides? Okay. So this morning, because of changes in the schedule, we have back-to-back advisors to the defense establishment of the United States. One in a general policy theme, and in between this presentation and noon with Kevin Rudd, we're set up for Kevin at noon, Kelly. Jonathan will be doing some book signing. So let me thank you again, and quickly give a microphone to a colleague of an economic organization we're in together. You're in for powerful information. I'm going to let you tell your story.
You were so kind. Thank you. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and a big thank you to David for inviting me to this conference. I've always found that the GIC conferences are really wonderful places, and they really bring out a lot of the main issues that are out there in the world. So, a big thank you to all of you. I wanted to present on the impact of and challenges of critical materials in the global supply chain. And so they're going to be putting up the slides pretty soon. But, I really think that the critical inputs, such as rare earths, get this right? Yeah. Such as rare earths, are really important for global supply chains for both defense and non-defense arenas. And, a lot of these non-defense and defense products use a lot of the same critical inputs. The shortages in key inputs in global supply chains have led to the shortages in finished products and also higher prices for both the finished products and their inputs. There's a lot of demand, but there's a shortage in supply. And I think that these have partially contributed to the rising inflation that all of you have heard about. And I think that it also can, as many of you know, potentially lead to a higher probability of having a recession. The supply of critical inputs can be negatively impacted by a variety of factors. And these factors include the political instability in the source countries for the inputs, the trade embargoes and disruptions in shipping routes, the insufficient supply in the inputs relative to rising demand, and also global pandemics such as COVID. I think that the important role of China in key inputs, particularly in rare earths as well as other critical input materials, has really increased the global dependency in the industrial base, and it's contributed to rising prices for a number of products. The Russia-Ukraine crisis has contributed to shortages in key inputs and supply chains. That's contributed to higher prices. And then we've also seen how COVID has led to the disruption in mining and processing of critical input materials, but also some of the transportation issues that we've seen with ports being closed and trade routes being closed. So I'm going to first talk a bit about rare earths, why we need them, what do we use them for. I'm going to talk about some of the sources of supply, China, Australia, the US, some of the other sources. I want to build also on some of the previous discussion and talk about some of the national security issues that we see in supply chains. I also want to talk about the strategic stockpile of critical materials, and there's a number of them. There's lithium, graphite, manganese, cobalt, nickel, and there's also some critical materials that are being impacted by the Russia-Ukraine crisis as well, like titanium, palladium, platinum. Finally, I want to talk about some of the solutions to critical material challenges in terms of government funding, which was addressed a little bit earlier, global collaboration, the development of other geographic locations, some of the alternative technologies, and also some of the substitution of products. So, rare earths. What do we use them for? Well, there are 17 rare earth elements, and they're used in a number of different products. I mean, one example is yttrium, europium, terbium, phosphors. These are used in a lot of light bulbs and panels and televisions. We have europium right up here in our fluorescent lighting. Gadolinium is used in rods and nuclear power plants. Lutetium is used in hospital imaging. Lanthanum makes up about 50% of digital camera lenses in smartphones. So, we've got it all around us. Neodymium, praseodymium, dysprosium, terbium, these are used for magnets. The neodymium, praseodymium magnets are very important for wind turbines, for electric vehicles, and the neodymium iron boron magnets are very important for the CD-ROMs that we have, the televisions, and they're used in a lot of our conventional automotive subsystems, like electric windows, power steering, things like that. So it's all over the place. And, of course, it's very important for defense. Neodymium, again, is important in missile guidance systems. Praseodymium is important for aircraft engines and satellite components. Lanthanum, we need those for optics and lenses and night vision goggles. Europium, again, is really important for LEDs. So a lot of different uses. But the issue is that with this increasing demand for products and this greater number of products needed for rare earth inputs, and the shortages in supply, partially because of COVID 2 years ago when a lot of production facilities closed down, the average rare earth export prices increased by about 36% from November of 2020 to November of 2021. But we also saw last year, fortunately, that partially due to the reduced impact of COVID, many of the rare earths declined from their height the prior year. And one example, again, is neodymium. This is one of the ones that I said was very important for missile guidance systems. Neodymium prices in 2021 increased by around 80%. They peaked at their historical level in February of last year. But by the end of December, neodymium had declined 14% from the beginning of 2022. Again, this only partially offset the significant price gain that we saw from the prior year. So prices have definitely been up for these rare earths. Now, who supplies these rare earths? Where do we get them from? You can see on this chart that China is really the big one. China produces 70% of rare earth mining in 2022. It was followed by the US, a distant second, at 14.3%. You can see that Australia was a very small amount. It was number 3 at 6% of global rare earth mining, and Myanmar is about 4%. So again, China is definitely the lead on this. But the good news is that there's a lot of sources of rare earth reserves, i.e. future supply. And, again, while China has the highest production of rare earths at 70%, it also has the greatest number of global reserves at 33.8%. But some of these other countries that you can see, countries like Brazil, also countries like Vietnam, they each have 16 to 17% of global reserves. But Vietnam's share of global production right now is only 1.4%. Brazil's share is only 0.03%. So there's a lot of opportunities. But again, we aren't doing too much yet. In the case of the US, which is a distant second in rare earth mining currently at 14.3%, we don't have as many reserves globally. We only have 1.8%. And in the case of Australia, which has the third highest share of global production at 6%, it only has 3.2% of reserves. So there's definitely a lot of opportunities out there. Now, on the next slide, which we're going to forward, there's been a real increase in rare earth production in China. You can see that there has been significant growth since 2014. In fact, if you look at the rare earth mine production, it's actually doubled as of 2022. However, because there has been so much demand for mining, China's share of global output has actually declined from 86% in 2014 to 70% in 2022. And again, some of this decline in its global share is due to the rise in the US in terms of its rare earth mining. Now, there's a lot of sources of rare earth mining supply, as I've said, but the growth is limited in some areas. You can see that China Again, it's the lead, but it only grew 75% over the last 4 years. The US, on the other hand, grew 200%. Some of the areas that still have a very small amount of mining, like Thailand, like Vietnam, they have grown significantly, 600% for Thailand, about 350% for Vietnam. So again, still small markets, but they're growing. And I think that we're going to see more of this in the coming years. Now, China plays an even greater role in refining than in mining, because first you have to mine the rare earths, then you've got to refine them and separate them. And I said that China had about 70% of global rare earth production and mining. Well, it makes up 85% of global rare earth refining. And since China has more competition in the mining portion of rare earth sector from other countries, it's been increasing its purchases of the mined rare earths from these other countries for refining and processing, because it's got a lot less competition in refining and processing. And the reason why it has less competition in refining is because of the risk of the economic contaminants. Thorium is a radioactive material, and that comes out when you're doing the refining. So naturally, the US, Australia, Myanmar lack the refining processes as of now. But I'm going to talk more about how they're developing them. So, in terms of China, the largest mine in China is located in northern China. It's in Inner Mongolia. It's called the Bayan Obo deposit, and it produces about 70% of China's light rare earth deposits. It is the largest deposit of rare earths globally, but it's been in operation since 1957. Now, the Chinese government has been engaging in consolidation of the rare earth industry because this enables the Chinese government to better influence prices, and also it enables it to lead to greater efficiency with the sharing of technology and some of the improved resource utilization rates. So it started these consolidation efforts back in 2016, where we were trying to get together 6 state-owned enterprises. At the end of December of 2021, China developed the China Rare Earths Group. This was supposed to be the large rare earth state-owned enterprise in the South, and it was a merger of several companies together. And the China Rare Earths then controls about 62% of the supply in the heavy rare earths. And again, it's the major factor in southern China now. And they're going to develop another similar state-owned enterprise with consolidation in northern China. Australia. Australia has a number of growing rare earth mine companies. And in fact, about 22 of them were traded on the stock exchange as of the end of last year. Actually, I guess it's 35 now. Yeah, 35. The largest firms are Lynas. Lynas has a market cap of about $7.8 billion. You can see that Iluka is number 2, about half of that. Arafura follows it, and Hastings. But Lynas is the second largest producer of neodymium and praseodymium globally. And remember, neodymium and praseodymium are very important for magnets. They're important for guided missile systems. The list goes on. Its Mount Weld deposit in Western Australia is the largest non-Chinese rare earth mine. It possesses among the highest grade rare earth deposits in the world. And what happens is this ore is processed at Mount Weld, and then it's sent for further processing to Malaysia. However, Lynas relies on China for turning those oxides into metal. Now, following the unofficial export ban on rare earths that China briefly imposed on Japan back in 2010, the Japanese government has made a much greater effort to reduce its exposure to Chinese rare earths. And as a result, they actually funded the development of Lynas's Mount Weld mine in Australia. Lynas is also developing a separation facility I'll talk about in a minute that's going to be in the US. Iluka is the second largest Australian rare earth mining company. It's developing a processing facility. Arafura Resources is developing the Nolans rare earth mine in northern Australia. This is one that has significant deposits of, again, neodymium and praseodymium. It's signed an agreement to assist South Korea. This is in coordination with the Korea Mine Rehabilitation and Mineral Resources Corporation. And it signed MOUs in 2022 with both Hyundai and the GE Renewables Energy to supply neodymium and praseodymium to electric vehicle batteries and also solar wind turbines. Hastings Technology is developing 2 rare earth mines in Western Australia, and it hopes to begin production in, I guess, next year in 2024, and it has signed agreements with 2 German companies, Schleifer and ThyssenKrupp. The Australian Strategic Materials is planning to develop a complete supply chain for rare earths, developing a Dubbo mine in New South Wales. Just like Arafura, ASM is also collaborating with South Korea with the Korea Mine Rehabilitation and Mineral Resources Corporation. Now, in terms of the U.S. has only one operating mine, a rare earth mine in the U.S. It's in Mountain Pass, California. It's owned by MP Materials, and it produces the 14.3% of rare earth mining globally. But again, it does not have a refining capacity. So what happens is the partially state-owned Chinese mining company, which is Shenki Resources, owns 7.7% of the company. And it is the sole buyer of the materials mined at Mountain Pass facility to be used for processing. So at the Mountain Pass, they mine them. They are then sent off to China, and there they're processed. And then the U.S. imports back 78% of the refined rare earth metal from China. So MP hopes to develop a complete rare earth supply chain now by 2025, which would include separation and refining and magnet production, as well as mining. Now, in February of 2022, February of last year, the Department of Defense provided $35 million to contract to MP Materials to try to expand the Mountain Pass facility in terms of production, but also to develop a processing facility. And in April of last year, MP Materials actually began building the new refining facility in Fort Worth, Texas. MP Materials has also signed agreements with GM to try to produce rare earth alloys and magnets for GM's electric vehicle program. Now, there's also been some collaboration between the U.S. and Australia in trying to develop non-Chinese rare earth sources. DoD provided Lynas, again, that's the leading Australian firm, with $120 million in June of last year to develop the first heavy rare earths separation facility in the U.S., in Texas. The surprising part of this is that Lynas would extract those rare earths from its Mount Weld mine and ship them to the U.S., where they'd be separated in the U.S., in Texas. DoD also provided Lynas with $30.4 million in February of 2021 to build a light rare earth separation in partnership with a San Antonio-based Blue Line. There's also some other sources of rare earths out in the U.S. One of them is the American Rare Earths that is doing some preliminary analysis of the mining sites in Arizona and also Wyoming. And there's a suggestion out there, preliminary analysis is suggesting that they could actually have the two largest U.S. rare earth mines. So that's some interesting stuff to come. There's a lot of other sources that are all around the world, though, that are developing. One of them is in Canada, where the Australian firm, Vital Metals, owns the only operating mine in Canada. This is the Nechalacho mine, and it's located in Canada's Northwest Territory. It's been mining since June of 2021. Vital Metals is also developing a key rare earth processing facility in Saskatoon, where the rare earth carbonates from Saskatoon are going to be shipped over for separation at Retex Norwegian facilities. Similarly, in Sweden, actually at the beginning of this year, the Swedish mining firm LKAB found what may be the largest deposit in Europe of rare earths, and it again is also collaborating with the Norwegian Retex firm to extract the minerals and then have them separated in Retex Norwegian facility. Again, though, this takes a while because the permits take up to 10 to 15 years, and there's a lot of concerns about that. Now, in terms of Norway, at the beginning of this year, Norway discovered significant offshore deposits that are basically between the Greenland Sea and the Norwegian Sea. And in Greenland, in August of last year, the, again, Australian firm, Neo Materials, purchased rare earth mining rights on Greenland's west coast. A lot of opportunities. Africa, a lot of operations there. There are existing mine operations in Namibia at the Critical Metals Loftel Heavy Rare Earths mine and also the Steen Camprel mine in South Africa. Australia's Peak Rare Earths Limited has projects in Tanzania. The UK firm Pensana is developing neodymium and praseodymium mine in Angola. And the Guernsey-based Rainbow Rare Earths has two African rare earth projects, one in South Africa and the other is in Burundi in East Africa. So there's a lot of opportunities out there. However, right now, the dependence of the U.S. and other countries in China for rare earth enables China to use rare earth export controls and bans as a strategic weapon. And, one great example was in September of 2010, when the Chinese government blocked all rare earth exports to Japan when tensions increased over a fishing trawler incident. The ban was subsequently lifted, but again, it led to Japan trying to reduce its rare earth imports from China. In fact, as a matter of fact, back in 2010, it imported 90% of rare earths from China, and as of 2021, that had dropped down to 60% because Japan was trying to get more of its rare earths from France and also from Vietnam. A second example was back in 2019 when China was considering using rare earth export controls in the U.S. as part of its trade war, but it didn't implement them. A third example was just in the fall of this year in September, where Department of Defense suspended deliveries of the F-35 fighter jets because there was a magnet being used with a samarium and cobalt alloy from China, which wasn't in compliance with the U.S. procurement laws. In early October, however, a waiver was passed, so again, the building continued of the F-35. But while the Pentagon suggested that alternatives could be considered in the future, China currently produces 70% of samarium cobalt magnets and 85% of neodymium magnets. So I think that this need for the magnets in the U.S. for a variety of military purposes can really lead to China in the short and medium term developing stricter export controls to increase their bargaining power. Also, further concerns have arisen regarding the U.S. dependence on China for rare earths that could limit the ability of the U.S. to provide economic pressure on China and to escalate if China escalates its pressure on Taiwan. In February of last year, China placed sanctions on Raytheon and Lockheed Martin and suggested that this could include their import of rare earths. And this was in response to the U.S. approval of the two firms providing $100 million in maintenance services to Taiwan's missile defense systems. Now, again, these incidents, I think, really provide lessons to the U.S. and other countries on the importance of developing strategies to diversify rare earth risk and also to expand domestic and overseas sources of rare earths. Now, there's also some very other important critical materials in the U.S. strategic stockpile. In fact, in 1989, our stockpile was $21.9 billion. But now, after the selling off of a lot of these minerals, we're down to only $881 million today. In March of 2022, the Biden administration put forth the Defense Production Act's authority to direct the DoD to designate 5 key metals, lithium, cobalt, graphite, nickel, and manganese, as essential to national security, and they authorized steps to bolster domestic supplies. Now, these critical minerals, in addition to titanium, palladium, platinum, really highlight the dependence of us on other countries, whether it's China, it's Russia, it's the Ukraine. So, starting with lithium, which is the next slide. Let's see. Yeah. As you can see with lithium, definitely Australia is a major producer, followed by Chile and China. But again, lithium, about 80% of it is used in electric vehicle batteries and electronic devices. But we only have one U.S. lithium production mine, which is in Nevada. Over the past 4 years, the U.S. imported about half from Argentina, 40% from Chile, and fortunately only a small amount from China, about 4%, and 3% from Russia. In terms of graphite, China, you can see, is a really big producer of that. Graphite is key for semiconductors, which was mentioned in the last presentation, and also in high-capacity electric vehicle batteries, like the production of lithium-ion batteries. Since 1990, the U.S. has relied on import sources. It does not produce graphite domestically. Over the past 4 years, our imports of graphite have averaged about 33% from China, and about 18% from Mexico, 17% from Canada. What's interesting is that Ukraine's halt in production between February and August 2022 led to a real drop in production from about 10,000 tons back in 2021 to 3,000 tons last year. Manganese is another key material, very important in steel production. We haven't produced manganese ore here in the States since 1970. So, the U.S. has been importing manganese about 67% over the past 4 years on average from Gabon, about 19% from South Africa. Nickel is another very important thing because it's used in the production of electric vehicle batteries, lithium-ion batteries, but a lot of other things as well. The U.S. mines only 0.5% of nickel globally through the Eagle mine in Michigan, and then its concentrate is exported to Canada and overseas since there are no U.S. processing facilities. Now, recent supply chain disruptions involving nickel have been partially driven by the political tensions in Russia, because although Russia only mines about 6.7% of nickel globally, it is the leading producer of Class 1 nickel that's needed for the batteries. So back in March on the London Metal Exchange, there was a substantive increase in nickel prices, and this was due to what was going on in Russia and the Ukraine. And the result was that there was a halt in trading that lasted for an entire week. Cobalt is another very important item because about 40% of it is used in superalloys in aircraft gas turbine engines. You can see the Congo is by far the largest producer of cobalt. You can see, however, that about 80% of that is processed in China. But fortunately, the U.S. imports of cobalt average about 22% from Norway, followed by Canada at 16%, Finland, and Japan. Michigan's Eagle mine, though, is the sole producer of it. Again, this is sent off to Canada for processing. Some other critical materials impacted by Russia-Ukraine. One of them is titanium. It was produced by one operation in the U.S. and Utah in 2022. We have a lot of uses of titanium in aircraft frames, jet and helicopter engines. China is a huge producer. Fortunately, the U.S. imports about 82% of it from Japan. But again, Russia and Ukraine have been important sources as well. However, Ukraine's sponge production fell 84% between 2021 and 2022, which has been a problem for a lot of the European companies. Finally, palladium and platinum, very important in catalytic converters. And we have only one company in the U.S., which is Montana, that produces that. Again, Russia is a major producer of palladium. We actually import about 34% of it from Russia. So definitely some issues. So what are some solutions to these critical mineral challenges? Well, one of them is the U.S. legislation on critical minerals. There's a $1.2 trillion infrastructure bill in November of 2021 for the rebuilding and further development of transportation and power markets. We saw Executive Order 14017 issued in February in 2021 to assess the weaknesses in critical supply chains. This resulted in the February 2022 Biden-Harris plan to revitalize American manufacturing and secure critical supply chains. There was a February 2022 executive order to assess the gaps in the supply chains in response to the semiconductor chip shortages. Over $135 billion has been spent in building the electric vehicle sector, and this includes a lot of trying to get some of these minerals up there in terms of lithium and graphite. But this has been provided by the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the CHIPS and Science Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, and back in October, the Biden administration's national security strategy identified also the importance of developing critical mineral supply chains. In addition to the government funding that we see within countries, and again, this is something that takes a long time, we've also seen the development of alternative sources of rare earths through collaboration between countries. And we saw again how Australian firms were receiving funding from DoD to build refining facilities in the United States. We've seen the investment by governments and companies in Australian mines. I mentioned Japan's help with Lynas Mount Weld Corporation, the linkages between South Korea and the Australian firms, Germany with the Australian firms. And there's also other sources of collaboration between countries. One of them is the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investing among the G7 countries. This supports low and middle income countries in terms of infrastructure investment in mining and refining. There was also the debut in June of the Multinational Minerals Security Partnership. Another solution is developing other locations, and we talked about that, the development Canada, Sweden, Norway, Greenland, Africa. Japan is also doing some methods for abstracting rare earths near the Ogasawara Islands. And finally, there's also some operations being done for alternative technologies. Northeastern University is trying to develop the tetranite mineral, which is naturally found in meteorites. Austrian scientists are doing a similar effect. A Chinese group is trying to develop an electric current method in rare earth separation through electrokinetic mining, because that helps with the radioactive contaminants. And then finally, another area is substitutions. For example, GM's first all-electric Cadillac Lyriq that was launched in March of last year is now using batteries that require 70% less cobalt. Because remember, cobalt has been a problematic metal in the electric vehicle supply chain, with 70% coming from the Congo. GM's also been very dependent upon South Korea in trying to further develop its car, but it's now hoping to move this whole battery manufacturing away from South Korea and into GM in the States by 2025. So to conclude, while there are continued challenges of rare earth minerals and supply chains in the short and medium term, there are, again, some long-term solutions. Again, just to review over the short and medium-term challenges, we have seen the rising prices of critical materials for tighter supply. We've seen the greater demand pushing up the prices. We've seen there's uncertainty regarding diplomatic challenges with China, as well as political instability in some of the key countries like Russia, Ukraine, the Congo. We've seen there are challenges regarding the length of time and the need for funding to accelerate mining and refining processes. And we've seen there's a lot of shortages of key inputs and finished products due to the COVID-driven production closures. Longer-term solutions, however, can improve productivity and reduce risk. We've seen the importance of providing funding for the development of domestic mining and refining facilities, the importance of collaborating with other countries, continuing to increase DoD stockpiles of critical materials, providing funding to support key products like these high-capacity batteries and magnets, diversifying inputs in terms of the type of input that we need. Is there another critical mineral we can use to replace another one? Looking at the geographic location of the source of the input, and also developing new technologies. But I really think that understanding the short and medium-term challenges helps in developing the long-term solutions. And I think that these long-term solutions over time can really help to support global cooperation, global stability, and economic growth. So thank you, David.
You have given us a tour de force.
I tried to keep it on time.
And within 2 minutes of the clock, an incredible presentation, very filled with substance. I understand why and how fortunate the United States is to have you as one of the advisors to our defense establishment.
Well, thank you.
Let's thank Nayantara.
Thank you very much.
We are 13 minutes away, Kelly, is that right? From Kevin Rudd. So we're going to break for 10 minutes, books, signing, and sharply at noon, we'll have Ambassador Rudd on the screen. Unless some foreign power derails the technology.
Hi, can you hear me?
We can hear you. Yes, can you hear us, Ambassador?
Yeah, you're speaking perfect Australian English. It's good.
Well, we are delighted and thank you very much for taking time for this final session of a program to have your perspective close as a closing keynote of a series that has taken place in 7 parts, discussed the military defense issues related to Europe and a shooting war, the worldwide pandemic effects economically, the financial sanctions, payments, global war, with all the ramifications in geopolitics and economics. We blended defense and economics, finance into this package of sequential presentations. The auditorium in the university is essentially a TV studio, so there are some cameras. We're recording this. The distribution of the series will reach many thousands of people. Your distinguished career as Prime Minister of Australia, I had the opportunity to be in some discussions with you in the Asia Society, and now your role representing your country to the United States. It's a marvelous perspective to give us a closing message. And I would ask, Ambassador, if you would say a couple of words about the Asia Society. A mutual friend of ours by the name of Betsy suggested that I ask you do that so that the audience knows about the Asia Society, because many do not. So we welcome Kevin Rudd for the closing keynote of this 7-part series. Please.
Well, thank you so much for that very warm welcome. And I'm sorry I can't be with you in Florida. I've just taken up a new job here in Washington, D.C. I started only 3 or 4 weeks ago as Australia's ambassador to the United States. In fact, 2 days ago, handed my letters of credentials to President Biden in the Oval Office, and was able to have a conversation with him then about many of the subjects that you've asked me to talk about today in the Indo-Pacific region more generally, and concerning China in particular. You ask about the Asia Society. Let me just make a point or two. Asia Society was founded here in the United States back in 1956 by John D. Rockefeller III. You may have heard of the family, the Rockefellers. They've been around for a while and are enormous contributors to American philanthropy. There are multiple Rockefeller institutions around the United States, led by the Rockefeller Foundation, Rockefeller University, you name it, the Rockefellers have been there. The Asia Society was established in 1956 with one central interest, and that was to help build America's unfolding relationship with the emerging countries and economy of decolonizing Asia. Asia in 1956 is a vastly different place to the Asia of today. You had newly emerging countries, newly emerging economies. And Rockefeller's vision was that here in the United States, we needed an institution to provide the welcome mat to people from the region, often visiting the United States for the very first time, not knowing what America was about. And remember, this occurred at the time of the height of the, let's call it the McCarthy period in the United States in the 1950s, when there is much suspicion in this country towards those coming from Asia. This was after the Chinese had secured their communist revolution in Beijing in 1949. This was after the conclusion of the Korean War in 1953, and it was before the Vietnam War, which erupted in the following decade. And it was, in fact, the same year as the famous Battle of Dien Bien Phu, when the North Vietnamese evicted the French from their colonial presence in Vietnam, and setting in train many of the developments we then saw through the tragedy of the 60s and the 70s. So Rockefeller's vision through the Asia Society was to build bridges of common understanding, begin to explore where values intersected, and to begin to explore where interests intersected between these new countries and the US of A. Since then, we've developed some 15 centers around the United States and around the rest of Asia. We are currently present in New York, Washington, as well as Houston, San Francisco, LA, and prospectively Seattle. Always open to the idea of opening in Florida. But around Asia, we're also in Tokyo, we're in Seoul, we're in Hong Kong, we're in Manila. We hope to be in Jakarta soon. We're in Sydney, Melbourne, Delhi, Mumbai. And because our European friends have exhibited a much more acute and recent interest in contemporary developments in Asia, we have now opened in Zurich, in Switzerland, and in Paris last year. Our mission statement at the Asia Society was to navigate shared futures. Navigating shared futures is a tricky prospect. Navigating is an active verb, which is how do you find the way through often complex and conflicting situations with conflicting interests and perhaps deeply conflicting perceptions of each other. Shared means that there's not a single future, but there may in fact be multiple futures. And futures, cast in the plural, not the singular, basically says the same thing. So to give you a practical example, on the US-China relationship, my colleagues and I have been working through the Asia Society on a project called Managed Strategic Competition, which recognizes the current competitive nature of the US-China relationship, which looks very much at the challenge of how do we manage that relationship in a manner which reduces the risk of crisis, conflict, and war by accident, and how do we manage the relationship in a manner which deters China in particular from taking unilateral military action against Taiwan. And we've been working on that as a conceptual framework and through a whole lot of second track and 1.5 track diplomacy with our Chinese friends now over the course of the last 12 months. And for those of you who are interested, last year I wrote a book on this subject called The Avoidable War, which is how to manage strategic competition between these two massive powers of the 21st century, United States and China. So that's a little bit about what we do at the Asia Society. As I said before, I left that noble institution, having been there for 8 years, left it only 1 month ago to respond to a request from our Prime Minister and Foreign Minister in Australia to come here as ambassador to Washington, D.C. I'm the first former Australian Prime Minister to ever be appointed ambassador to the United States. There have been 23 ambassadors before me. And so I'm looking forward very much to the opportunity and the challenge which it represents, given how strong, deep and broad the Australia-US relationship is, both under Republican and Democrat administrations and governments in Australia of all political persuasions going back to the darkest days of World War II. What you've asked me to speak about today is the outlook for Asia, global risk and public policy. So, as I said before, I'm sorry I can't be with you in sunny Sarasota. We have many Australians working nearby at CENTCOM, US Central Command, in nearby Tampa, and I look forward to visiting down there again soon. I've had the opportunity to be in Florida several times already in my Asia Society capacity, having been out to Tallahassee and sat down with Governor DeSantis, as well as opportunities to visit with other folks in what is an extraordinarily dynamic state in the United States. I understand this morning you've discussed the impact of Russia's war on Ukraine on supply chains. I wanted to switch the focus to a region closer to my own home, and that is what's unfolding in the Indo-Pacific region. The Indo-Pacific, in terms of global risk and policy, is of central significance now to the world. And so what I'll offer here today is simply an Australian perspective. While working in Washington, D.C., that is certainly part of my focus. It's also been part of my core focus for the 10 years I've worked previously, running a think tank at the Asia Society in New York. We've engaged with governments, both Republican and Democrat, and with the US corporate community on these complex questions at a think tank level, and I propose to do so again as ambassador. So I want to start by giving a brief overview of the strategic outlook for the region before turning to consider some regional risks, including geoeconomic risks in the Indo-Pacific, including the value of what we see as regional partnerships across that dynamic part of the world. The challenges facing Australia, for example, and the Indo-Pacific community writ large, including the global community, are immense and they are fast changing. What we in Australia seek, of course, is a region that is open, stable and prosperous, and an international order which is respectful of international law, rules and norms. But the Indo-Pacific, which is central to global prosperity and security, is now being reshaped, not least being reshaped by the rise of China. Australia's view is that we all have a responsibility to support the conditions that underpin strategic stability and peace. This includes agreeing and observing predictable rules of behaviour, deterring aggressive behaviour wherever it might occur, and being clear about our strategic intent. It also means engaging transparently in the Indo-Pacific to ensure that countries in the region have agency and can make their own strategic and economic choices, rather than being permanently forced into taking binary positions either with Washington or with Beijing, given that is not the predisposition of most countries in the region. To deliver on stability in the Indo-Pacific region, Australia also supports efforts by the United States to pursue guardrails and open lines of communication with China to minimise the risk of miscalculation. We welcome opportunities for collaboration ourselves with China on global challenges such as climate change, on energy security, and of course on public health. One of my key priorities in my new role is finding ways to help widen the aperture for US-China collaboration. For example, I've written in the past about the potential for US-China collaboration, not just on climate change, but in other areas such as international cancer research, where China offers a huge number of potential case studies for US pharmaceutical companies to actively engage in product testing at scale, given the size of China's cancer-suffering population. Of course, if we collaborate in these areas, it also helps bring down the overall political and strategic temperature. At the same time, we cannot ignore the economic dimensions and the geopolitical dimensions of strategic competition. Both the US and China are part of the same global economic system. So we want to reinforce, again, the rules-based order when it is under threat, strengthen the multilateral trading system where we can, and work with regional partners and businesses to help build economic resilience. This will be central to protecting the international system that has underpinned stability and prosperity since the Second World War. So let's focus for a moment on the regional risks that we face. The key risk we all seek to avoid is conflict and war. Conflict is certainly not inevitable. War is certainly not inevitable, but it requires us to engage intelligently as major powers and as great powers to find a way through. If conflict were to break out of the Indo-Pacific, most particularly over Taiwan, it would have catastrophic humanitarian and economic consequences that would extend far beyond the region. It is in all our interest to work together to maintain a status quo in support of peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait. The ballpark economic impact of a war between China and the United States over Taiwan are mind-blowing. A think tank recently reported from December last year that some $2 trillion in global economic activity would be disrupted if China attempted to blockade Taiwan. To that end, a core task that I'm focused on in my new role as ambassador is better understanding the specific challenge of deterrence vis-a-vis a Taiwan contingency. That is, how do we best and most effectively deter China from embarking upon unilateral military action? Beyond that, what is needed is for both sides to better understand the other's strategic thinking and to conceptualize a world where both the US and China are able to competitively coexist, even if in a state of continuing rivalry reinforced by mutual deterrence. A key element of Taiwan's resilience is its economic resilience, and the business community has a role to play in ensuring ongoing business confidence in Taiwan, as others seek to undermine that. Beyond Taiwan itself, the South China Sea faces many risks and challenges, and these also threaten international trade and regional stability. Australia is deeply concerned when countries engage in activities that are inconsistent with international law, which are provocative and destabilising and do not respect the rights and freedoms of others. We want to see a peaceful South China Sea where international law, such as the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, what we call UNCLOS, is respected and adhered to, where waterways are still open for trade, and where there is space for all states to exercise their rights and freedoms. Let's look at geoeconomic risks in the Indo-Pacific. The specific regional security risks and flashpoints I've outlined above are basically geopolitical risks, but the economy also remains fundamental. Australia's view is that we are economically stronger when global trade flows freely. The benefits of trade must be shared, both within our countries to include marginalised groups and more broadly shared across nations, and certainly across the wider Indo-Pacific region. It is no longer possible to insulate our trade policy from geopolitics. Economic policy and national security policy are now more intertwined than ever, with resilient domestic economies underpinning national security. Promoting more trade is a key part of how Australia itself builds the economic future that we want, with secure, high-paying jobs and an open, internationally competitive economy powered by clean energy can produce. But there are growing risks to this vision. Global supply chains continue to experience major disruptions, first caused by COVID-19 and now exacerbated by Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine. Australia's supply chains have remained resilient, but Australia and our partners remain vigilant as to the risks, especially when excessive market concentration exists. Preserving and growing open markets underpins global supply chain resilience. And by having more markets to trade with, we afford our businesses with the opportunity to diversify their own supply chains and reduce their dependency on any one single market. Another risk we face in the Indo-Pacific region is that of economic coercion. Australia opposes this practice, as we've done most recently in the case of China, and we are concerned that geographic concentrations in key global supply chains provides leverage for economic coercion. To deter the use of economic coercion, we must stand together to ensure it does not achieve its aims. And we must work to support the conditions where differences are resolved through dialogue and where sovereignty and internationally agreed rules and norms are in fact respected. Australia's experience has reinforced to us that when it comes to economic security, many of the things that have been central to our prosperity also help us maintain the resilience and flexibility to respond to future shocks, targeted or otherwise. They do this by maintaining open and functioning markets, underpinned by a strong multilateral trade system where we can achieve one, and diversifying our trade as well, and investing in critical economic assets and partnerships. We in Australia are also acutely aware of the importance of critical minerals. The world needs diversification of what we are currently facing with highly concentrated supply chains, so that the world can have confidence about the reliability of the supply of critical minerals into the future. At present, production is geographically concentrated in a limited number of players, in particular China. While many of these minerals can be found around the world, the concentration of processing is particularly stark. Australia, as a producer, has a key role to play. For example, outside of China, Australia is the largest producer of battery minerals in the world. Our natural endowment as a minerals and energy supplier, in fact, a minerals and energy superpower, and our position as a leading global producer ensures that we have and can have a major role as a supplier to key allies and partners, including the United States. Like the US, our government is making its own investments at home to help grow our critical mineral sector, to increase global supply and address supply chain concentration. For example, our critical minerals facility provides some $1.3 billion US for investment to de-risk early to mid-stage projects in critical minerals processing. Second, the government has also committed to establish a $10 billion US National Reconstruction Fund to provide loans, guarantees and equity to help build Australia's own related industrial base. And third, this includes a US $2 billion fund to invest in green metals as part of the government's Powering Australia plan. We're also refreshing our national critical minerals strategy and developing a new national battery strategy, including a particular investment facility designed at establishing a manufacturing precinct in my own home state of Queensland in Australia. Queensland, by the way, is as sunny, as bright and optimistic as the state of Florida. That's as we see ourselves in the state that I call home, back home. Strategic competition is forcing states to recalibrate the level of risk that they tolerate in their economic policy settings. Our view is that it's important that while states might de-risk certain sectors where integration presents a security risk, outside of such sectors, we should all prioritise economic openness. In this respect, we in Australia support and welcome the United States' increased economic engagement in the Indo-Pacific region through bilateral relationships, a deeper partnership with ASEAN, that's the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, and the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework launched by the Biden administration called IPEF. IPEF brings together 14 of the fastest growing economies in the Indo-Pacific, with members making up over 40% of global GDP. It's not small and the potential is great. With this dynamic grouping, IPEF will be able to address contemporary challenges, including supply chain resilience and diversification of the type I referred to before. Also, clean energy transition, as well as the future nature of open digital trade, rather than digital trade controlled by a single country or a single corporation. There will be greater opportunities for investment in the region by US businesses to respond to the region's needs, to bolster economic resilience and to create more American jobs as well. That's if we get IPEF right. And if we do so, it will strengthen economic ties among like-minded allies and partners right across the Indo-Pacific. Think of Australia, think of Japan, think of the Republic of Korea, think of our friends in Southeast Asia, and also think of India. Which brings me to my final set of remarks on the value of regional partnerships. Risk mitigation also requires this. And of course, in this context, we cannot simply leave China out of the equation. Indeed, China is critical to navigating and managing the risks that that I have outlined above. Australia's own relationship with China has been up and down in recent years, and it's in both our national interests to continue a path towards stabilising that relationship for the future. We in Australia have taken some steps in that direction, but it will take time for the relationship to improve in overall and sustainable terms. China, for example, will need to cease applying what remains of the coercive measures it adopted against Australia economically some years ago. The Australian government remains open to working with China, including to address shared global challenges like climate. But we will also continue to speak out in support of international security and global rules and norms that underpin our prosperity and security as Australians, as Americans, and among our network of allies across the world. Australia, the changes we face in our complex strategic and economic environment mean that our alliance with the United States and partnerships across the region are now more important than ever. The nations of Southeast Asia are key partners, and we must engage to shape the region we want to live in. Indeed, the centrality of ASEAN and ASEAN-led regional architecture, including the East Asia Summit and the ASEAN Regional Forum, is critical for the stability of the Indo-Pacific writ large. With Australia and the United States now both having comprehensive strategic partnerships with the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, Together, Washington and Canberra are well placed to bolster this important regional institution. Furthermore, our relationship with Japan is growing closer and more important than ever before, underpinned by significant trade and investment ties, strong security ties, and a deep affinity between our two peoples and our two democracies. Our economic and development cooperation in third countries, in particular in the Pacific Island countries in Southeast Asia, is already well unfolding. Australia welcomes the recent release of South Korea's first Indo-Pacific strategy, released in December, and we look forward to working with the ROK to advance our shared interests in a stable, peaceful, and prosperous Indo-Pacific. India, the world's fifth largest and fastest growing major economy, and its young and vibrant population, which will soon overtake that of China this year, offers vast opportunities. As one of the world's fastest growing energy consumers and an emerging technology superpower, India's energy transition presents unparalleled prospects for climate change resilience and clean supply chains. India is critical to shaping the kind of region we all want. Australia is also focused on minilateral groupings that bring various countries together. For example, the Quad, the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, and its shared vision for the region, one that is open, stable, prosperous for us all. Quad partners, that's India, Japan, the United States, and Australia, are committed to achieving this vision by working together alongside partners in regional countries, such as the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, with one common objective: to shape the region that we want to live in together. Next month, Prime Minister Albanese of Australia will host the 2023 Quad Leaders Summit, and that will involve representation from the US, from Japan, and from India, and we hope in all cases at head of government level. Indeed, this year, all Quad partners are playing a strong leadership role in promoting a positive agenda globally, and the Indo-Pacific, through India's hosting of the G20, will be an important milestone in this direction. Japan will be hosting the G7 this year, and the US itself will be hosting APEC later this year. I won't speak for these other forums, but within the Quad, where we are hosting ourselves in barely a month or so's time, our four countries will be focused on responding to the infrastructure needs, the climate needs, scaling up clean energy supply, and bolstering, most importantly, overall economic resilience. To conclude, the challenges faced by countries and the business community alike are too great to resolve unilaterally by any country. We must work together as friends, partners, and allies to affirm rules and norms that have served us well and are now being tested and challenged by others in the global economy and across the multilateral system and within the Indo-Pacific as well. It is in all of our interests to protect the rules-based order and the trading system. Australia shares these interests with the United States and with our regional partners in Southeast Asia, as well as with Japan, Korea, and India. And we share this with you, the business community, and we recognise the leading role you in business have in helping us in government to ensure regional security, prosperity, and stability right across this vast region called the Indo-Pacific. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Thank you for the time, for the message. And when we first discussed scheduling you to close this conference, we never expected the surprise that we would now have you speak to us with a comprehensive message from your new position. And we wish you great success as you advance an enduring relationship between Australia and the United States. Thank you very much.
And all the best to all of you at the conference and your conference participants. Thank you so much.
That is going to conclude our series. We were kind enough to get closing comments from the new ambassador of Australia to the United States, and he took the time to put together this picture in a global framework. What a wonderful way to end 7 sessions that started in this second year of this series. So the Global Interdependence Center, the University of South Florida, folks who helped sponsor, put this program together, we can now conclude. I'm going to ask my colleague in this effort, General Gray, for closing comment, please.
Thank you, David. I feel very confident in saying that when we started this 2 years ago, we never envisioned that we'd have a former Supreme Allied Commander of Europe speak to us twice, a governor of the Federal Reserve System, and a sitting ambassador come in and join us at the University of South Florida Manatee, Sarasota Manatee campus, and virtual. An amazing, amazing thing. 2 years ago, we started this, and our very first presentation, we had a professor give an amazing history, if you will, of the relationship between Russia and Ukraine. And that set the stage for us. In 2 years, we've talked about the military implications of the war in Ukraine, how drones and emerging technology are changing the face of warfare. Cyber. There have been cyber attacks in Ukraine, cyber attacks in Russia, probably outnumbering what's happening in Ukraine, and cyber attacks here. We actually had the first commander of the United States Cyber Command talk to us about what the United States is doing to protect itself and what capabilities we may be able to use in the future. We talked about potential nuclear accidents if Russia was to damage one of the nuclear facilities that's in the Ukraine. Would that be a tripwire that would trip Article 5 of the NATO, where an attack on one is an attack on all, because you have no way of controlling the radiation of where the nuclear radiation would go, be based on winds, which prevailingly would go towards the east and impact Russia more than anybody else. We had a very enlightening discussion on a military ROE, the rules of engagement. General Deptula and General Breedlove talked in depth about how no military supplies that are coming through NATO channels are allowed to be used outside of the border of Ukraine. Now imagine this. You've got a supply chain, a huge depot, if you will, sitting just inside the Russian border. You've got a mass of troops just inside the Russian border, and the Ukrainians are not allowed to attack it because of the rules of engagement that NATO and the United States, being a leader of NATO, have placed on them. Very hard to prosecute a war when you're sitting there playing rope-a-dope, if you will, and you're absorbing the blows, but you can't export the blows. It's a very interesting way of doing it. We also moved into the impact of the war in Ukraine on Europe and the world. And we talked about food supplies. The Ukrainians supplied so much corn and so much wheat throughout Europe and through out towards the Middle East and everything, and that was shut down for a long time. And we had some worldwide experts come in and talk to us about the food supplies, the impacts it was going to have. And Brandon came back this year and said some of the predictions ended up being inaccurate, that we didn't see quite the rise that we thought we would in wheat and other things. And we found workarounds. We had experts come in and talk about natural gas, fuel. We're going to have the worst winter ever. All right, it's going to have massive humanitarian implications, and we ended up with a very warm winter, so we lucked out there. We talked about humanitarian implications, and General Breedlove mentioned that there were 14,800 children that had been abducted, all right, and taken over into Russia. And that is, in fact, a war crime. And one of the questions was, when will we hear the United States accuse Russia of a war crime? The very next day it happened. Okay, so he spoke on a Friday. He said they've been pressuring the administration, and the administration came out the next day on a Saturday and accused Russia of war crimes. And that will go to Den Haag into the World Court, and we'll see what happens with that downstream. We've talked economics. We've talked the war's impact on the bond market, the war's impact on the stock market. We moved into crypto just yesterday, and it was just an amazing enlightenment hearing that whole discussion there on how we went. And then today, I thought I knew nothing about crypto. I really learned I know nothing about rare earth. And just a brilliant presentation. As a military man, just shook me to the core. I used to work for Lockheed Martin. I was there when they suspended production of the in delivery of the F-35. So here you got a major company that's got an airplane, doesn't have an engine, it can't deliver it, it can't get paid. Major implication. If you're at war and you can't get the supplies to remanufacture engines, repair engines, or whatever, and it's all coming from your enemy, that's going to be a major implication, all right? So I want to pass on some thanks. And the first thank's got to go to this young lady over here, Kelly. This would not have happened without Kelly and her team that's done such a great job for us. So thank you, Kelly. I want to thank Dr. Holbrook and the University of South Florida Sarasota Manatee campus. When I approached her, she not only said yes, she said, let's grow it a little bit. And then we grew it, and we brought in David, and it went to another level, to say the least. So I want to thank USF, and I want to thank David for your organization here, and also for the GIC and what you've been able to bring here to make this little vision I had just grow exponentially. I'm very, very proud of it, to say the least. I'm very happy that the Air Force Association supported me in doing this and helped me line up some of the speakers that we're able to get. It's a phenomenal organization, and as I said earlier, we are the organization that tries to make sure Congress understands the needs of the Air Force, because no military organization can lobby. So you got to have an outside organization that can go talk to Congress for you about what you really truly want. It's imperative that I thank all speakers, all panelists, all moderators, because it would not have happened without them, to say the least. We've had some really, really phenomenal panels that have taken us in areas that have just been astounding over the 2 years. And I want to give you my final thoughts, if you will. The military's job is to anticipate the worst, prepare to figure out how to make that not happen. But if it does, how can you win that situation, all right? It's said inside the military's role is to break things, to kill people. It's the last thing you ever want to do. It's the last thing you ever want to do. But that's what we are. We don't build nations. We don't do all this other stuff that you've seen us do over the past. And when we focus inside the Pentagon, there's a saying out there. It's called 4+1. The four things that you focus on are Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, and terrorism. So you got your four major players, all right, and terrorism. Food for thought. I made a prediction that within 5 years we'd probably see the draft come back. I'm going to tell you, we have not had a major terrorist attack in the United States in quite a while. September 11th, okay, 9/11. I'll predict that we're going to have one again. Our borders have been open. We left so many critical assets and so much money in the hands of the Taliban, it will come back to bite the world. Prediction, okay? So you're going to see that terrorist thing rise up again in the near future, I'll predict. Ukraine, where do we go from here? We've talked for 2 years about it. Nobody thought this was going to be a long, protracted war. It has been. Every general officer we've had up here and many of the civilian speakers have all said, we could come back here next year, most likely, and talk about the third year of the Ukrainian war. So this has turned out to be a long, protracted war that we didn't want. Dr. Holbrook said something this morning. She very emphatically mentioned the conflict in the Ukraine, because she and I got into a discussion yesterday. The United States has not been in war since World War II. We've been in conflicts, all right? To go to a war, Congress has to declare a war. The last declared war in the United States was World War II. Everything else has been the Vietnam conflict, the Korean conflict, the desert, everything else. The difference is when Congress mobilizes the nation by declaring war, all assets are now focused and they're all lined up, and everybody is collecting aluminum, rubber, like it was in World War II, if you will. You're selling bonds. You're financing your war smartly versus just by debt, which is how we finance conflicts, okay? So think of this as a regional conflict that has the potential to become a world war. And when you think of it in that standpoint, it's scary, all right? And the longer it protracts, the worse it can get, all right? China. In September, we said, let's end the conference on China, thinking the Ukraine would have wound down, and what is the next potential? I could not have been more proud, astounded, and happy with the day we've had today. It's just been absolutely mind-boggling to think about. And I apologize for losing General Carlisle. He was at the Pentagon all day yesterday, there all day today, and he got caught in a classified briefing, could not break out. When he did, he said, I can give you 25 minutes. And I said, nope, you needed a full hour, and the audience needed to hear that full hour, and they needed to have the questions. You needed to hear their questions. So anyway, his apologies. And if we come back next year, I'm sure we'll be able to get him. So China's watching us. Are we truly watching them? And if we're not, hopefully we've opened up some eyes today, and we'll make sure that everybody that joined in virtually, everybody in this room, now has a better focus on that very, very important country and what they're going to do. Every single aspect of our discussions for 2 years comes back to economics and national security. And I don't think that the city of Sarasota has had quite this kind of forum ever, where we've had such phenomenal speakers and such a great agenda to focus on the economic and national security strategies that a war in Ukraine has got for us and what China potentially can. So once again, my thanks to everybody that's been a part of this. David and Dr. Holbrook, has been one hell of a ride. So thank you very much.